Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am finally here for my 2023 World Championships primer video. This is the one everybody's been waiting for. This is the big one that we're going to be doing on this channel before the start of the World Championships. I'm incredibly excited to finally jump into it. In this video, we are going to be going over all 23 teams at the World Championships, or that have the ability to qualify for the World Championships. We will be going over all 5 of their players. We will be power ranking all of them from number 23 to number 1. Not only the teams, but the players as well. I'll be giving playstyle analysis. I'll be talking about everything, and so this is your comprehensive guide towards what you can expect to see at the World Championships here in 2023. You're just not going to get a more comprehensive video than this one that's going to be put out. So again, apologies if it's long. I'm sure it is, but we've got a lot of information to cover, some things to talk about before we jump in. First of all, check out some of the other pre-Worlds coverage videos that we've done on this channel. A couple of days ago, we went and posted a meta report video to kind of talk about some of the picks you can expect to see champion-wise at the tournament. And then just a couple of days ago as well, we posted a top 20 video for the top 20 players at the World Championships. Of course, we'll be going over all of them today as well. But if you want a more in-depth breakdown on the players that you really can expect to see kind of dominate the tournament, that video is definitely a must-watch. You can go ahead and check them out up in the iCard as well. But I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time at the beginning of this. One last thing, leave a like on this video. It really does mean a lot. I usually don't ask for these at the beginning of videos. I usually wait until the end, but we put a ridiculous amount of time and effort into these videos, especially this primer. You know, of course, we watch every single region all year long, as you guys know if you follow the channel. If you're new here, hi. I've watched all 4 of the major regions, the LCS, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL, every single week, and I've covered them on this channel, so I promise I have some insight as to where these teams are going to be. And then, of course, we also watched all of the playoffs for all of the teams that qualified out of the minor regions as well. So you're not going to get a more comprehensive overview, but I would really appreciate it if you left a like for a lot of that work that I guess we all put in at the beginning of this tournament. But here is the results of it. Let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go from number 23 in my power rankings team-wise to number 1. We'll be talking about every player on each team individually. I'll kind of give a ceiling and a floor of maybe what you can expect from each team. Spoiler alert, basically every team here is going to be relatively competitive in their own little bracket, but I will be tier ranking them as well. I'll kind of distinguish when we go in between each tier as we go through it, but that means we get to start with number 23 in the power rankings, who unfortunately gets the distinction of coming in last. Well, this is the start of my F tier. This is the lowest tier that I have. I hate to give out any F tiers, because if you make it to Worlds, that's already such a major accomplishment, but there are a couple of teams at this tournament that I just don't feel are on the same level, even in the play-in stage, as some of the better play-in teams, and so we're going to be kicking off the F tier and kicking off my power rankings at number 23 with Team Wales, the number 2 seed from the VCS in Vietnam. I just don't really love this team. I was actually very underwhelmed with a lot of the tape that I saw from them in the playoffs. I know a lot of people really like the VCS. I know a lot of people are expecting Vietnam to maybe break out. They look at them as one of the stronger minor regions, and, you know, we can kind of talk about why I think there is some optimism to believe that a little bit later in this list, but when you're talking about the 2nd seed coming out of the VCS, you know, TW just really didn't feel all that dominant to me. And watching their tape, it really did convince me that they're going to be major underdogs, even in some of the easier matchups in this tournament. So let's go ahead and go over what their roster is looking like. Their roster is Sparta in the top lane, Beanjay in the jungle, Glory in the mid lane, Artemis at AD carry, and BA at support. A couple of players that, you know, longtime international fans might be familiar with. Beanjay, obviously, last year making it with the Buffalo. Artemis has played here before. BA has played here before. A couple of players that I think a lot of people are going to see and say, like, oh, well, at least they have experience. At least these players have been to international events, to Worlds before, and, you know, they're not entirely, I guess, inexperienced and negative players, but I don't know, man. Individually, like, mechanically, they were not super impressive in the playoffs. Now, I do want to make a little bit of a caveat. This probably applies to Wales more so than it applies to any other team that we're going to talk about in today's video, but I didn't watch the regular season. I didn't watch them when they were supposedly a lot better. I heard they were a lot more consistent during the regular season, but the playoff tape just didn't work for me. Like, it wasn't very good, in my opinion. I watched every single one of their playoff games, and even in their wins, they were a little bit shakier than I think I would have wanted them to be. So let's go over each individual player and why I believe that. We can talk about all the negatives, I guess, after we talk about the positives, and really the big positive for this team and the saving grace for why I think they're here is Glory in the mid lane, who I think is just a spectacular player. In my opinion, he's the best mid laner in the VCS right now. That's kind of the vibe I got from his tape. He was just dominating lane. He was consistently creating pressure. He was actively keeping his team ahead. He really felt like a 1v9 performance in a lot of those games, especially when they were facing GAM. It felt like Glory was really the one that was stepping up and creating a lot of the action for the rest of the team. If you have optimism for this team, it is likely going to be centered around this mid laner. This is very similar to what I was talking about at MSI with a team like R7, where it felt like their entire game plan and their team kind of revolved around their mid lane spot. I think Glory definitely kind of applies to that. He is incredibly talented, incredibly good. He likes to play playmakers as well, which I think is generally just a big positive. You can see the Ahri being his biggest pick over the course of this year, but even something like the Nico was very highly played for him. These are champions that want to get out on the move and want to be, starting fights, want to be taking skirmishes, and I think that's a good style for Wales. Maybe you can surprise quite a few people if Glory can generate these leads and start moving around the map, because I don't think it's like completely inept of talent outside of him. I just think that in comparison to maybe some of the other teams on this list, that Wales is just not quite as dominant in my opinion. I think the next best part of the team is probably the bot lane, Artemis and BA. BA in particular I think is a very stable player, not someone that I'm entirely overjoyed about. I think he's fine. He was solid, especially on some of these more consistent engagers, things like the Rakan and the Rel that maybe don't need as much setup in order to succeed, but he doesn't really make a lot of mistakes, and I think that can generally be a positive. It's not like he was going out there and being this big flashy playmaker and trying to make these crazy plays, but what he also doesn't do is go out and die for no reason, right? He's very consistent, very stable, and I think that could be a positive for Wales. Artemis is an interesting player to talk about in the idea of this team because he's given such a huge role in what Wales wants to do. Glory, for as much as I consider him the best player and what they really do play around, he isn't playing these like big hyper carries, and they're really not putting him in a situation where he's going to be the one to win team fights in the late game. It's basically always Artemis. He's pretty much consistently going to be given as many resources as possible, and I don't know if that's the right way to go about winning some of these games. He's not an awful player, but he just has a major role, and he hasn't necessarily lived up to that in terms of the production that he's put out on the Rift. I still think he can be fine, but big role, low production, not always something that I'm super pumped about, but I think him and BA are stable enough to be able to, potentially win some games. Where I start to get concerned is the top side of the map. I have both Sparta and Gen.G coming in as the bottom players in their roles at the tournament, 23 for both, because I think both of them are just average players, and I think that that's unfortunate to say. We'll start with Sparta. He is the definition of a weak side top laner. That's just kind of how they have played him. They put him on Renekton, on Cassante, whatever, and just left him up in the top lane. He basically gets no attention from this team, which is fine. He's not, again, a major negative, but I don't really see an opportunity for him to be able to kind of overperform that ranking. He had opportunities in the VCS playoffs, and I just didn't really see it nearly as much, and so Sparta's just kind of whatever for me, one of the few players at this tournament that I really just feel is whatever. And then Gen.G has his moments. I certainly don't want to say that he's not, trying out there. He's very aggressive, but I feel like he's aggressive in the wrong moments. He's someone who doesn't really create a lot of early action, but really wants to skirmish a ton in the mid game, and typically speaking, if you are going to do that, especially if your mid laner is going to be roaming, you need to be a little bit more active in trying to set up for it in the early game, and it just doesn't feel like he does the prereqs to take those skirmishes, and I think it can definitely cost him in a lot of different scenarios. And so when you're looking at Wales, it just doesn't feel like they have a ton of, synergy together at a global stage. I can see why they would succeed really well against weaker teams, because I think individually, players like Glory and BA and Artemis and even Gen.G, I think they're probably just better than a lot of the players that they're playing against in the VCS. I just don't think that's going to translate super well to the world stage. Unfortunately, somebody had to come in at the bottom of my rankings, and unfortunately for this list, that's going to be Team Wales. And then moving on to number 22 in the power rankings, and this is going to be the other team that I have situated in F tier. I think that there are really only two teams that I consider to be the lower in this tournament, and unfortunately, this team is in it. Coming in at number 22 for me, it is going to be Detonation FocusMe, the #1 seed from the LJL. I have them as the number 22 team at this tournament. I have them as the other team in the bottom tier with Team Wales, and I just don't really have a ton of faith in this team. There are a couple of reasons to feel better about them than you would about a team like Wales, and I'll kind of talk about that and why I do think that they are definitely better, why Wales was a pretty easy choice for bottom, and then everybody else was a little bit of a scramble, but why I also think they are probably more so in a tier with them than they are with the teams above them as we go through. First of all, have to note, the lineup that you see on your screen, I have no idea if that's the one that they're going to play. That's the one that I watched when I watched their playoff tape, and so that's what I have to go off of, and so that's what I ended up ranking, but if the reports are to be believed, Utapon is going back into the bot lane, and Oppamen is coming into the top lane, a long-time top laner in the LJL. If that's the case, sure, maybe that increases the floor of this team, but I have no tape on Oppamen this year or in recent years to even go off of, and so I don't really know what to tell you. Maybe he's really good, maybe he's not so good anymore. I don't know. I'm going to talk about this lineup because this is the one that I watched, and this is the one that I can actually analyze, but their lineup is looking like Utapon, or Oppamen, in the top lane, Steel in the jungle, Arya in the mid lane, Milan, or Utapon, in the bot lane, and then Harp at support. Certainly an intriguing, collection of players, a lot of veterans, mostly veterans on this team, and then one rookie, and the rookie was different at MSI. It was obviously Toltu in the top lane. He ended up getting benched midway through the LJL split because he just wasn't performing like they wanted him to. He had a ridiculous amount of expectations. I saw a ton of flame for him online that obviously was just too far, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about how this team ends up operating. The reason that this team falls into F tier for me is just the consistency. I really don't feel like there is a lot to be super excited about on this team. I think that there is one, fun, interesting carry, and even then, I think that, he's a player that I don't have a ridiculous amount of confidence in comparison to maybe some of the other interesting players, but the distribution of wealth on this team is not very good, and I don't think they're very good for this meta at the current moment. The good player is probably Arya in the mid lane. Now, a lot of people are very familiar with Arya. Obviously played in the LCK last split for KT Rolster. I was a lot lower on him then, but he's been in the LJL forever before that. Coming back here after that LCK split didn't necessarily work out for him, and he's kind of resumed his post as the best mid laner in the LJL, which is great. It's a great place for him to be. One of the best players in a minor region is certainly not an awful career for him to have, and he certainly was the carry for this team. When you look at basically every single metric, or even just watch their games, right, the eye test, he is what they like to play around. He is certainly the type of player that wants a lot more resources and wants to do something with them. The Kai'Sa was really fun to watch from him, and that's something to watch out for. Milan certainly doesn't play Kai'Sa, and so Arya being able to pick it up could certainly be an interesting option for this team with how strong it is right now, but he is kind of the funneled carry of this team, if you will. He's somebody that they want to put a lot of resources into, and he can produce. I just don't know if he's going to be expected to be able to produce as well as every other carry, especially because I think the talent surrounding him isn't quite as good. So I have him ranked at 18th. He's kind of in this cluster of mid laners that I think is really solid, but not necessarily like game-breaking unless you have really good talent that's going to facilitate them in a super high way, and I just feel less confident about that for DFM than I do for other teams. Other positives for this team are obviously the two other major veterans, Utapon and Harp. We'll talk about Steel in a second, who is one of the other veterans, but I don't think he necessarily is as strong as these two are. Utapon was just really good wherever they put him. He was really good in the bot lane before they moved him into the top lane, and then, watching his tape in the top lane, he was awesome in the top lane. Way better than I expected him to be basically immediately. Was playing tanks, was playing lane dominant champions, and was doing really well on them. I actually really like Utapon in the top lane, but he is an upgrade to this team in the bot lane as well. He was really solid there. I wanted to check out some games from him because if he is going to be playing in the bot lane, I needed to see how he was playing this year, and he looked really good. And so, fan of Utapon. I think he's very consistent. I think if he's playing in the bot lane, you're probably feeling a little bit better because that role just matters a lot more, and I think he's a better player than Milan, but wherever he's playing, he's going to be a positive. He was really good in both roles. And then Harp, I think, is a very solid, very stable support. A little bit more of an aggressive player than what we were talking about before with BA. Certainly going to go out there and try to make some plays as opposed to just trying to keep the game salvageable, but isn't going to throw away your game either. Just a solid support that you're happy with. And then you've got Steel in the jungle. Now, I like Steel. I've liked Steel a lot more in past years, but he's really just kind of become the facilitator for this team. Like, he takes zero resources, and honestly, it's kind of to the detriment of the team at times, where it really feels like he's a non-factor in the late game. Like, he's willing to deal damage, but it's not super easy for him to deal damage because he doesn't always have a ton of gold, and he certainly doesn't always have the levels to be able to keep up with a lot of the other junglers that he goes up against. He's just kind of throwing away his game to try to get Arya in particular leads. And while that is very good for Arya, and Arya does a good job of trying to carry towards the back half of games, I'm just not sure if that's a style that's going to not be punished on the world stage, right? If you're willing to just completely give up jungle farm, well then all of a sudden you're giving a ton of advantages and a ton of pressure over to the other side of the map. And so that's definitely a concern with what Steel has shown me on tape over the course of this year, but just something to keep in mind. I don't think he's a bad player, and he's certainly shown that he can carry in the past, but just something to keep in mind. And then Milan, or, you know, whoever ends up being in that spot in the bot lane, I was not impressed with Milan. He comes in as my bottom ranked AD carry if he is going to start here. I just wasn't super impressed with what I saw from him. The team clearly was not super trusting in him because he's probably the lowest resource AD carry I've ever seen. Especially in this meta, it's very hard to get away with just not giving resources to your bot laner, but man, did DFM try. And Milan, for his credit, played low resource well, but he was basically a non-factor for this team. If they're going to win games, it's going to probably be through Arya, or it's going to be through Yutapon, and especially if it's Yutapon and Harp in the bot lane, I think that would be an upgrade to this team, but I don't think it's enough for me to push them above F tier. I do think that they're a bottom 2 team at this tournament. I think their style is just too volatile. I don't really trust the way that they want to play the game, which is very predictably through one player and not really through anybody else, at least resource-wise, and I think that's going to come back to bite them. I think their recent international lack of success is definitely being factored in here, but I was low on them going into MSI, and that ended up proving to be correct. I'm low on them again going into Worlds, and I don't imagine that that's going to change once again. And now moving on into our D tier. We jumped up a tier here. The bottom 2 teams I really do feel like are the only 2 in the F tier. And so kicking off our D tier, this is kind of our tier that I would say of teams that are going to be interesting in the play-ins. I could theoretically see them making one of the top 4 spots, getting into one of those best of 5s and trying to get their way in, but certainly not teams that I'm expecting to be able to do that. I would expect some of the more bigger favorites to be able to get themselves out of it. And kicking off our D tier and coming in at number 21, it is going to be the CTBC Flying Oysters. Very, very intriguing for them to come in this low on the list. Very similar to what we were talking about with Team Wales. I think a lot of people are going to look at them coming from a stronger region than maybe some of the other minor region teams and just assume that they're better than them because of that. But I really don't know if they are. I really don't know if I necessarily believe that. They have a couple of really interesting pieces, and I certainly don't think they're an awful team, but, you know, especially when you start watching and researching what this team has been able to do over the course of 2023, a lot of the confidence you have in them just kind of starts to get worse and worse and worse. They were really bad in the regular season. They were the number 6 seed coming into the playoffs, and realistically, like, going back, I don't watch the regular season for a lot of these regions, but I felt like it was necessary for the Oysters to see why they were performing so poorly, and they were not good. Like, they did a lot of things very poorly. Their laning stats were really bad. They were making a lot of really big mistakes in the early game. Like, I just didn't understand what they were doing. They cleaned some of that up in the playoffs, which is obviously why they're still here, but they're, you know, their mistakes are definitely still present, and I think they're going to be a little bit more exploitable than people give them credit for. But let's go ahead and go over their roster. Their lineup's looking like Rest in the top lane, Gemini in the jungle, Jimmy in the mid lane, Shun at AD carry, and Shousey at support. A couple of these players you're going to be familiar with, either if you follow the channel or if you just follow international events or perhaps just, you know, major regions, if you will. You know, Jimmy, and obviously coming back over from North America, was with 100 Thieves Academy for a bit. Shousey has been playing in the LPL for a little while, and so a couple of players that I think you'll be familiar with if you are, you know, familiar with some of these more major regions, but I think the rest of the players on this team are definitely some question marks. We'll kind of talk about the good, and then we'll get to the bad. I think the biggest piece of good for this team, in my opinion, is Jimmy in the mid lane, and I know it doesn't necessarily reflect that, but this is probably a good opportunity to say something that I should have said at the beginning of the video, which is, of course, when you're looking at these player grades, they're not comparable between positions. That's just not really how this works. Number 23 in the mid lane role is way better than number 23 in the top lane role, or in the support role, in my opinion, right? There's just more deep talent in the mid lane at this tournament, and so, you know, obviously you've got to take some of these with more of a grain of salt. When you see a player ranked at a lower number that I say is better, you've got to take my word for that they are better. They just play in a position that is maybe a little bit more stacked in terms of the talent that they have, and that's the case for Jimmy here in the mid lane, who I really do think is probably the most consistent member of this team. was really solid throughout the year for them, even when they were playing poorly. What Jimmy does well is not make mistakes. He really doesn't have any sort of major problems. If you do want to point out a weakness in his game, his laning isn't fantastic, and that was kind of a problem for him in the North American Academy system as well, is he's just not really this dominant laner, and I think that that is translated to the PCS, but he's, again, a really consistent mid-game, you know, skirmisher and a good team fighter. He's not going to cause you problems, but then you look around at the rest of this team, and it's like, okay, well, if he's not going to cause you problems, then who's going to give you the positive plays? For one, I think Xiaoxi is a positive for this team. I was actually quite low on Xiaoxi going into watching this tape. I didn't really feel like I was going to enjoy what he was doing very much, and while he certainly had his problems in the playoffs, which we will talk about, this bot lane in general was much worse in the playoffs, in my opinion. I still think that he was the one creating most of the plays in the mid to late game for this team, and I think that that is very good. Having a good engaged target in the support position is solid. Do you have players that can follow up on that? Maybe. I think your best carry on this team, ironically, is probably Rest in the top lane, who you wouldn't necessarily associate as a carry player. If you're familiar with Rest over the course of his career, he's kind of been weak side for most of his career, but he was given more opportunities in the playoffs in particular for this team, and I do think he was probably their most consistent carry, and going to be interesting to see if they continue to go towards that well, or if they want to put him back on weak side to play more towards jungle again, because jungle got a ton of attention in the regular season and at the beginning of the playoffs for the Oysters. Gemini's just one of those players that I think consistently loses when he doesn't have resources and doesn't really do a whole ton when he does have resources. Maybe I'm just too low on him. I know a lot of people really like him. He got a ton of, like, Player of the Series awards when I was watching, but I really didn't feel like he was this gigantic difference maker for this team. He's a good team fighter, that I want to give him, but his early game as a jungler is incredibly weak, especially in comparison to a lot of the other junglers at this tournament, and in my opinion, that's by far the most important part of the game when you are in that position, and so I don't know. I don't expect him to perform super well at this tournament. I don't think he's particularly meta right now. He does like to play these more late game scaling, you know, facilitators, which are good, but he's just not a great early pather, and I think he gets exploited for it even in the PCS. I imagine it will be the same in the play-in stage here, and so when you're looking at the Oysters, you can probably see why they're so low. I think a lot of people would see DFM, honestly, as a team that is better than this team, and honestly, I kind of agree with that. Like, I really wanted to put the Oysters in D tier, but they did play quite a bit better. Rest, in particular, played a lot better, and I think Jimmy played a lot better in the playoffs, and if they're going to be on that upward trajectory, then they should, at the very least, be in this D tier, but this is a team that is just barely squeaking into that D tier and was very much on the fringe for me, and so I don't have a ridiculous amount of confidence in what they're going to be able to do, but a kind of, you know, tier 2.5 region team, or a tier 1.5, if you will, region team, I have to at least give them some confidence that they're going to be able to do something because they do have talent. I just don't know what's going to get them very far. And then moving on to number 20 in these power rankings, again, smack dab in the middle of D tier. This is a pretty large tier. As you can guess, with 23 teams, the tiers are going to be a little bit larger than usual in terms of how many teams are in them. But coming in at number 20 for me, it is going to be Movistar R7. Rainbow 7, R7, the LLA number 1 seed, whatever you want to call them. I like this team quite a bit. A lot of people are going to be surprised to see them, I think, above some of the teams that we've talked about, above DFM, above the Oysters, but I think they're better, and I think they're better by a considerable margin. I'm not going to say it's a tier jump from the last team to this one, but I feel significantly more confident in R7 than I do in the Oysters. I still think they have their problems, which is why they're in D tier and not higher, and why I'm not necessarily putting them inside of the, you know, the top 19 or top 18 or something like that, where I really think they could compete to get out of play-in stage, but I think R7 is solid, and I certainly don't think they're a team that a lot of people can overestimate. I think that this is probably the best team to ever come out of the LLA, and I'll kind of explain why as we go through this. But their lineup is looking like Bong in the top lane, Audi in the jungle, Mireu in the mid lane, Seo at AD carry, and Lions at support. A couple of interesting pieces for this team. I do like how they've constructed it, because I really think that they have a lot of complementary playstyles on this team. There are a couple of players who are really good with resources, and there are a couple of players that are really good without resources, and I think that they've really defined how they want to play through those players and how they can unlock the most of them, and they're not afraid to change up their style either. I think this team really found its form in the playoffs, not that they were bad in the regular season, but another one of these teams that I think really started to figure out how they wanted to play the game, or maybe they just mentally locked in by the time the games mattered most. So let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with Bong. in the top lane. A player that I went into tape kind of expecting to just be completely neutralized by. That's kind of how I felt with him when I watched him not only before MSI, but at MSI as well. It's just this weak side, you know, top lane tank that didn't really do a whole ton, especially with how the meta has developed. You can notice there are a lot of players like that at this tournament. That's because that's a pretty strong role to have on your team at the current moment, but Bong was better than that. He was significantly better than just weak side top laner. He did play weak side a lot. He didn't get a ton of jungle attention, and he wasn't necessarily a focal point for the team, but he was a really solid laner. Like, he was somebody that I think really has improved on his laning a ton from when I watched him before MSI and at MSI. He was consistently, you know, in the right position, knowing how to play lane matchups a lot better, and he's a really good team fighter. Like, his damage output, even on champions that aren't necessarily major damage dealers, is incredibly impressive. One of the players I was impressed the most by, going back and watching film. A lot of players at this tournament I knew about, and I've watched tape before, you know, going into this tournament, but Bong was somebody who I think really raised his stock in my eyes by quite a lot when I watched the playoffs, so really good from him. Audi was kind of the playoff savior, if you will. This guy was absolutely absurd. I was really low on him going into MSI. He was one of the reasons I was low on R7, just in general, why I had them as my last ranked team, even though I really liked a couple of the players on this team, is because I didn't have a ton of faith in Audi to be able to kind of continue some of the pace that he's had over the course of his career, but this playoff run was also fantastic. He was the best player on this team in the playoffs, and I don't know if that's entirely sustainable, but he was a major playmaker. I don't think he was like this nearly as much in the regular season. It didn't really seem like he was from, you know, some of the, you know, player of the game voting awards and just the talk that I heard around him. His stats certainly weren't showing that, but I didn't watch regular season tape. Like I said, I just watched every single one of their playoff games because I think that's a better indicator, but Audi was really fantastic in the playoffs, and so if he's going to be able to keep that up, that's big for them. Mireu was somebody who I praised endlessly before MSI. This was a big reason why I was high on R7 going into MSI, was Mireu. And now here, I'm just not feeling it nearly as much. I don't feel particularly as strongly about Mireu. The talent is absolutely still there. I think it's very clear that he is just more talented than everybody else that he's playing against in the LLA, which is what I said about him going into MSI. But I think the problem is that he just has, like, no off button. He is just the most aggressive, I'm going to risk take, I'm going to try to make every single player that I've ever seen. And I do think it can hurt him at times. There are situations where he gets himself into bad spots purely because he just doesn't know that he can't 1v9, right? I still think he's incredibly talented, and if you can reel him in a little bit, I still think he can be the best player on this team. He can really raise the ceiling for them a lot. But for now, like, he's just a really good player that is going to give you some bad plays every once in a while. And then Seo and Lions, I think, are both also solid. I think Seo in particular has moments where he's a lot better than others. I think he's just very consistent, right? He's not going to give you awful plays. He's not the best laner in the world. He's not an awful laner. He's a really good team fighter. I think that's really where he's going to show his strengths. I do think Lions is a little bit more of a question mark in the support position. I wasn't entirely thrilled with his tape on engagers. He's just a little bit passive for me. I would like to see him be a little bit more aggressive, especially if you're going to consistently play those engagers and not something that can be a little bit more, I guess, universally helpful. I want to see him be the primary engager and go in and try to make these plays, because Audi was doing a ton of that in the jungle position. Obviously, that's great, but if you get Lions connected on that, like, this team can level up in that position as well. So R7, a really interesting team to talk about. I think they're a better version of what they were going into MSI, and they already surprised a lot of people at that tournament. Like I said, I think this is the best team that Latin America has ever produced as a region, and hopefully they can prove that on the international stage. I'm not necessarily predicting them to get out of play-ins or anything, because it's just very difficult with only 2 spots to get out of play-ins, but this is certainly not going to be an easy team to beat, and one that you have to take very, very carefully, because they will upset you. And then moving on to number 19 in these power rankings, we're finally in the teens. You know, we've gotten some of the more questionable teams out of the way, and I really do think this starts the teams that, like, realistically could make it out of the group stage in the play-ins. I don't know if they're going to. Obviously, only 2 can make it out, and we're still quite a long ways away from the top 2 in the play-ins, but these are all teams that I think realistically could do that. It's still within the D tier. I think it's fair to say that, you know, the Oysters or Rainbow 7 could do that, but these are the teams I think that are really interesting. So let's kick it off with number 19, and number 19 is going to be Loud, the number 1 seed from the CB LOL. Really like Loud. I'm super in on this team. I love how they play, how aggressive they are, how willing they are to be in your face and to team fight you all the time, to skirmish, to take 2v2s or 3v3s or 1v1s in a lot of situations, more than basically any other top team we've seen from a region in quite a long time. I love the way that these players play the game, and I think they are going to shock a lot of people with just how mechanically skilled they are, because they really are incredibly talented. Now, that's not to say that they don't have problems, right? They're certainly not a perfect team. There's a reason they're still coming in at number 19 and not higher, but I really do like this team quite a bit, and we'll kind of get into some of the reasons why. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Robo in the top lane, Croc in the jungle, Tinones in the mid lane, Rout at AD carry, and Seos at support. Love everything that this team does. There are a couple of standout players that I think really are sensational, and I have to kick it off with one of the players that I think is becoming a channel darling. I don't talk about the region enough to really kind of consider him a channel darling, but if you want, you know, kind of a sneak peek into one of my favorite players in the world right now that I think should be getting a bigger opportunity, it's Seos in the support position. An absolutely dynamic player that really can just do it all. He's incredibly versatile, and the funny thing is, I think he's having a down year, quote-unquote, right? Like, I don't think he's been as dominant in the summer split as he was when I reviewed him in the spring split or a couple of years ago, not even a couple, last year or whatever, but he's just ridiculous. If this is a down year, he's still the best support in Brazil, and I don't think it's particularly close. I think he could step into North America, like, right now and be a top 3 or 4 support in the region. That's genuinely where I view him as a player. He is that good, and I think he's a huge asset to this team. A really good engaged player, has struggled a little bit in lane, which we will get to. They were a little bit iffy in the playoffs in terms of what I was looking at in terms of lane stats in the bot lane. I wasn't super pleased with how Rout was playing a lot of those situations, which we'll talk about, but I think Seos in general is someone I just have the utmost amount of confidence in. I think he has ridiculous amounts of upside, and he's someone that I'm very excited to continuously see here at an international tournament. But let's talk about Rout now, his running mate in the bot lane. I'm not nearly as confident in Rout. He's really just kind of a good AD carry, and that's for, like, the CB LOL. I think he's average at best. Like, he's someone who's not really going to destroy you, but his laning is very inconsistent. I think that there are times where he really does well in team fights, specifically if the rest of the team is ahead, and they can put him in a situation where he can really just kind of do his job. I think he's very good at doing his job, but if you ask him to do more than that, typically speaking, he's not really going to dominate in that same way. This isn't Brance from last year, who I think was really somebody that started to break out and really showed that he could create his own advantages if he needed to. I don't really see that in Rout. I think this is a little bit of a different playstyle and a little bit of a worse player, in my opinion. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm not nearly as high on Rout, but what I am high on is the jungle mid duo, because I think that they're peaking at the right time. Croc was spectacular in the playoff run that Loud went on. I think that there is, I guess, potential for regression from what he had in that playoff run, but I'm not going to expect it because I do think his playstyle fits very well towards what this team wants to do and how this team likes to play and what the meta is right now, which is early game aggression. I think Croc is a very fast player. He's consistently looking to create and generate advantages super early on in the game. In general, that's kind of what Loud likes to do. And I personally think that's very strong at the current moment. I think Croc is going to fit in very well. He might not rank ridiculously high, but that's because, again, jungle is one of those positions that is very deep at the tournament, but you know, Croc's a really solid player. He's certainly not someone you can overlook. And then Tinones, who's just been the pinnacle of solid, great player, right? Like, consistent, everything you could want, plays his own set of champions, basically no matter what the meta is. Not that he can't play meta. I mean, LeBlanc and Ahri have been meta, but Syndra over the course of this year, LeBlanc being your #1 most played, like, that's a style that he wants to play. And you know what? He does it really well. He's a very good laner. He's a very good team fighter. He's a very good skirmisher. I wouldn't say that he's particularly elite at any of these traits. I don't think he's like top 1 in the play-ins at any of them, but he's not bottom 3 in any of them. And I think that that's just as important, right? He's just a very well-rounded, all-around, jack-of-all-trades kind of mid-laner, and I think that that is valuable. I trust Tinones quite a bit. Probably the most successful player in the history of the CB LOL, in the history of Brazilian League of Legends, and that's always good to see. It's great to see him continue to do well. I thought he played really well this year. And then Robo in the top lane. I was very complimentary of Robo going into MSI this past year. I hyped him up as one of the surprise, like, watches of the tournament, and while it kind of panned out at MSI, I honestly think he took a little bit of a step back in the summer split from what I watched in the playoffs. He just was very underwhelming to me. Obviously, weak side top lane is just going to be a little bit less impressive, but I don't think he was nearly as good in the 1v1s as he was in the spring split. That was something I praised him for a ton, was not that Loud played a ton around him, but rather that I think he created a lot of opportunities that other top laners just didn't necessarily create nearly as much of, and I didn't see nearly as much of that in the summer split. Obviously, we know he's super talented, and I know it's still there, but if I was underwhelmed by one part of the team, it was probably Robo in the top lane, just kind of being a fine top laner. Not a problem, but probably not a strength either, at least over the course of what we saw. But I think there's more than enough talent on this team to really put them in a pretty high capacity, right? Number 19 in my power rankings. I love Seos. I think Croc and Tinones are a very solid jungle mid duo. And even though I have question marks about Robo and Route in terms of how they've been playing in recent weeks, I still think that this team is good enough to be able to overcome the likes of Oysters and Rainbow Seven. I just think they're kind of the better team out of those, although I think it's comparable, which is why they're in the same tier. But if this team made, you know, some upsets happen and got to one of those best of 5 series, I could see some upsets happening. Like, this is not a team, even more so than the ones we've talked about before, that you can take lightly. They are genuinely going to press you hard every single game, and if you're not ready for it, it's gonna be a problem. And so Loud's definitely an interesting proposition, and again, like I said about LLA, probably one of the best teams that CB LOL has ever produced. So really, really fun to watch them, and hopefully they can show some of that energy that they showed domestically on the international stage as well. And then jumping into our final team in the D tier now, and that's going to be my number 18 team in my power rankings. This is the team that I think is at the top or the closest towards being a team that could compete to get out of the play-in stage. They are the final team that I guess I would say I don't project to get out of the play-in stage, which is where D tier ends. And so coming in at number 18 for me, it is going to be GAM Esports. The VCS number 1 seed is going to be coming in at number 18. I think this is a pretty fair place to put them. Now, GAM's had some problems. I'm certainly not going to try and pretend like this is the exact same team that they were, I don't know, like 2 years ago. But they still are very good, and I think there's reason to believe that they're going to do better than what they showed us at MSI, which just was a little bit of a disappointing performance. They've made a pretty big roster change, which we will get into, that definitely raises the floor of their team, and they honestly have a couple of players that are just way better than anybody that we've talked about up until this point, and so I feel pretty confident in putting them at the very least here at number 18. But their lineup is looking like KIA in the top lane, Levy in the jungle, KT in the mid lane, Slater at AD carry, and Pallet at support. Love some of the players on this team. I have very high expectations for what they're going to be able to do. It's not entirely positive. There are reasons to believe that they might not be able to live up to expectations once again, but one of those reasons is absolutely not KIA. He is unbelievable. This dude has absolutely become everything that we could have wanted him to be, and then some. I mean, he's the best player in the VCS, he's the best player on GAM, he's the MVP of that region. He has been phenomenal for this team over the course of this year, and he's the biggest reason that you have a ton of optimism when it comes to GAM as a team as a whole, because there aren't really a lot of top laners in the play-in stage in particular that are going to be able to go up against KIA and survive. We've been talking a lot in this video about weak side top laners that are fine, that are going to be able to do well. Even on some of the teams that I like, you know, there are top laners that are just good enough, right? Because you're in a meta where you can get away with that, where top lane can kind of be isolated, where you can put them on Renekton or on Cassante and just kind of let them survive in the 1v1, let them be relatively useful in team fights because of their champion and just play through other lanes. But if you've got a top laner like KIA on the other side of the map, like, he's gonna punish that. He's gonna punish it relatively heavily, and so I actually really like the composition of having him on the team. He's a really great Jax player, genuinely one of the best in the world, at least as far as what I was able to see, and I fully believe in him. I fully believe that he is going to be everything that this team needs him to be and more. KIA is the star here. Make no mistake about it. I think the rest of this team is also really good. The other player that I really want to shout out is KT here. I think a lot of people are going to bring up Slater next, and I'll kind of talk about why I'm maybe a little bit more hesitant on Slater. Trust me, the upside is there. We will get to him, but KT is probably the most reliable player on this team, even with KIA, because KIA can have bad games every once in a while. He's not always dominating lane like 1v1 100%, but KT is always going to do what he does, which is be a super stable, super good mid laner. There's unfortunately a reason why I put him below Glory in terms of the mid lane rankings in the VCS, and that's because I think Glory has more upside. I think his laning is a little bit better, Glory's is, that is, and I really don't, you know, see KT as this dominant, like, lane early game player, but he's probably the best team fighter in terms of the mid laners in the play-in stage, although I think it's close with him and a player that we'll talk about soon, but he's really, really solid. Like, he's just going to give you consistent play every single game, and I think he's an asset towards GAM. He's basically everything I said about Tinones in the previous segment, except I think KT's just a little bit better. He's a little bit more mechanically talented, and he does have a little bit of juice when it comes to the early game skirmishes and the early game 1v1s, and so I like KT, I like KIA, and we got to talk about Slater. I mean, the conversation around Slater is certainly an interesting one because his good moments are great. Like, they are phenomenal, just as good as anybody else in this tournament. I think there's reason to believe that Slater is the best AD carry in the play-in stage. Like, there is a conversation to be had in that regard. I just don't know if I can confidently say that. First of all, he just doesn't have any experience on an international stage, and that's something that concerns me. But even more so, like, when he loses a lot harder than the rest of these players. His early games have been kind of bad, I'm not gonna lie. Some of it you can blame on palette, which I have quite a bit, which we'll see when we talk about it, but he's not the most consistent player. He really doesn't understand when he should fight and when he shouldn't fight, but man, you get him a little bit of gold, he's gonna win you the game, like, basically immediately. He's ridiculously talented, and he is a positive for this team. I think when they go up against teams that are a little bit less talented than they are, and they are just kind of able to express their mechanical difference, I think Slater's gonna look like $1,000,000 in those games. I just worry a bit about going up against some of the better teams in the play-in stage, like, you know, PSG or whoever wins the qualifier series. I think it's going to be a little bit of a problem for Slater. It's certainly going to be more of an interesting challenge, which I'm excited to see, but he has all the potential in the world to be like a world's Swiss stage, a world's main stage, like AD carry. He really is that good right now, and so hopefully he can continue some of those great performances. And then you've got some other players. Levy's on this team still in the jungle. A lot of people really like Levy, obviously a very famous player from his time back on GAM in like 2018 when he was, you know, showing off the Nocturne, looking really fun. He's, you know, made his excursion to North America, come back here, and he's been a staple for this roster for the past couple of years. I think this was a little bit of a down split for him in terms of what he was doing. He still was very aggressive and was still dealing a lot of damage. Certainly someone that you can rely on to be very active on the map and to actively try to make plays, but I was a little bit more disappointed in his early games than I typically had been. I felt like a lot of his laners were winning, basically independent of him, and yet he was still behind in gold a lot of the games, and that's definitely a little bit disappointing. I still think Levy's a good player, but maybe not the dominant one that we all kind of expect him to be going into tournaments like this. And then there's Pallet in the support position. I don't hate Pallet. I don't want to sit here and try and make it out like he's awful, but I was really not impressed at all with what I saw from Pallet. I think Pallet's laning is actually pretty poor. Probably the weakest laner in terms of supports at this tournament, and that's why he comes in as my number 23 support at the tournament, my last ranked support. I don't think he is going to perform like that because he's on a team that's just better than that, and I think there's going to be some players that don't perform well because of the teams that they're on, but I don't really trust Pallet individually as a player. Maybe I'm just giving him too much flack for some of the early problems that him and Slater have had in the 2v2s, but it doesn't necessarily feel like he's making a ton of plays towards the back half of games either. I just have a lot more confidence in the rest of the team than I do in Pallet, but overall, generally, I still like GAM a lot. I think their solo lane duo is incredibly good, especially for the stage of the tournament they're going to be at. KIA is going to absolutely body a lot of the top laners that he goes up against. If Slater hits his upside, this team absolutely could make it out of the play-in stage. I don't even think it's really all that much of a question. If you get the best versions of KIA, Levy, Kati, and Slater all at the same time, this is probably a top, 16 team at the tournament, and I think that that's a really good thing to say. The problem is you do need to get that, and we didn't get that last time they were at an international tournament, and they made changes because of it, so hopefully we can get a better version of them. Now, I'm a little bit weary on trusting them entirely, but I think it's pretty clear that at the very worst, they have to be at the top of this D tier as a serious contender to make a splash, make some noise in the play-in stage. And that officially does conclude our D tier, which means it is time to kick it up a notch and go into our C tier. Now, I do want to be very direct about this. This is by far the biggest tier in the entire tournament. Most of the teams in the tournament are in C tier because truly I define C tier as solid teams that I could genuinely see doing well. I could see them, performing well against good teams. I could see them, beating the bad teams, but I could also see them underperforming. A couple of these teams are going to be worse than the teams that we've talked about, and a couple of these teams are probably going to be better than some of the teams that are above them, but they're all good in their, they all have their own flaws, right? They all have their own strengths and their own weaknesses, and I think they're just a little bit more defined than maybe all the teams. But like I said, this is most of the teams at this tournament. So kicking off our C tier, and coming in at number 17 for me, it is going to be PSG Talon, coming in as the #1 minor region team at this tournament, and I don't even think that's disputable. I honestly think they are a tier above every other minor region team here in 2023. I think they're that good, and honestly, I considered putting them higher. They really are that dominant because, we'll talk about it, but this jungle mid duo is legit. Like, very, very, very legit. And I'll talk about why I have some confidence that it's going to be able to stay that way, which is crazy considering some of my thoughts on these players in years past. But their lineup is looking like Aji in the top lane, Gen.G in the jungle, Maple in the mid lane, Wako at AD carry, and Woody at support. I love this team. I love these players. I think they're going to be incredibly interesting to watch and incredibly interesting to see if they can overcome some of the expectations that maybe people have generally with minor regions, but Man, we gotta start this off with the jungle mid duo. There really is no other place on this team to kick off the discussion, because Gen.G plus Maple could genuinely be the best jungle mid duo in the play-ins by, like, a gigantic margin, and I could see them dominating games. These numbers may look ridiculously high in terms of the player rankings for these players, but honestly, I really do believe in them that much. Gen.G is coming in as a top 10 jungler at this tournament, at Worlds, which is pretty wild to say, but he kind of has the resume to back this up. I know it doesn't necessarily feel like it, because he's never really been a starter, but remember, he played in the LPL for a majority of last year, and he was awesome. He was really good for EDG. He was a big reason why that team started to go on kind of a run towards the back half of the year and make the playoffs in the first place. Of course, Gen.G was better, and so they put him back in, but Gen.G's great. He's an elite level player. Gen.G being slightly worse or even close to on par with Gen.G is a pretty good endorsement, and then he goes to the PCS this year to get full playing time, you know, back home to the PCS, I should say, and he's dominated that league. He's clearly been the best player in the PCS, and it's not been particularly close. I know some people are going to vouch for his teammate Aji in the top lane, but I'll talk about why I'm not quite as high there. But Gen.G is, like, awesome. He would fit right in one of the top regions right now. He is a top 10 jungler at this tournament, and he's a big reason why I have optimism for this PSG Talon team. I think he's the single best player in a minor region right now. I think that it's pretty clear to say that, and I feel very confident that he's going to be able to do everything they need him to do. He's a facilitator first and foremost, though. He's not really a carry player. That was actually a big reason why he worked so well for EDG last year, was because he wasn't someone that wanted to hog a lot of the resources, and I actually think it works super well because you've got a couple of players that I think like resources in this team. Aji and Maple, to be precise. Let's start with Maple, because I feel a little bit more confident talking about Maple than I do about Aji. Of course, I've watched a lot of Maple over the course of his career, not only because, you know, he's a legend for his time on Flash Wolves, but his time in the LPL, his time in the LCS, and now back here in the PCS where everything started, and I really do think that he's playing some of the best League that he's played in the last, like, 3 or so years right now, and I think that's a really good sign to say. He was a dark horse for me, a very big one, in the spring split when he was still on TSM in North America. I was really hyping him up. I was saying that he was a lot better than people were giving him credit for. He was an all-pro for me in the LCS, and that's definitely something to point out, but I think he went back to the PCS and got better because his aggressiveness has increased, like, tenfold. He is super confident now, and I think going back to a region and maybe his home that he feels a lot more comfortable in, I think has helped him out a ton. I'm not trying to sit here and say that he's a perfect player. He struggled in the LPL for a long time, and he struggled for a reason. He just didn't have the same kind of killer instinct that I think he had earlier on his career, but it really does feel like he's found that again, which is why I have a ton of confidence that he at the very least is going to be a competent mid laner at this tournament. I think you could lower him down to number 14 or 15, and I could feel pretty good about that, but I feel pretty good about him at 12 as well. I think he's just a really solid player. And they've got Aji in the top lane, the player that I think a lot of people are going to talk about as well. I wasn't quite as impressed with Aji as maybe I was expecting to be. A lot of people were hyping him up as the best player in the PCS, and I just saw Gen.G and Maple as a little bit more impactful towards what this PSG team wanted to do specifically in the playoffs. However, maybe his regular season was absolutely ridiculous, and maybe they just decided that they wanted to go in a different direction for maybe some of the more important games. I'm not entirely sure why you would do that if he is as good and as consistent as you say he is, but he was fine in the playoffs. He was a good weak side top laner that did everything he was supposed to. He does have carry upside, and he's a great split pusher. I think that's something that, you know, probably does kind of put him ahead of a lot of other top laners at this tournament, is I think if you leave him isolated 1v1, if he's able to generate that lead, he's going to punish you a little bit more than maybe a lot of the other top laners. Not in terms of the team fight stage, but in terms of separating the team and creating issues. But I think outside of that, he's just a very good version of what we've talked about before. I don't think he's as good as a player like KIA on GAM, but I think he's really solid and definitely a positive for this team. Now, if this team does have an issue, and the reason that they're down at number 17 and not up there with basically all of the Western teams, it's this bot lane, which I just don't feel nearly as confident in. Wacko in particular, I'm not sold on. I'm really not sold on him being this elite level AD carry at this tournament. I think ADC in general is a weaker role depth-wise at this tournament, which you can probably, you know, gather from how I've talked about a lot of these players. I think a lot of these ADCs are just fine, and I think that that's a little bit unfortunate in a meta where ADC is really important. It's kind of crazy that they all got here, but Wacko, I should say, is fine, right? He's a good player. He's not going to ruin you games. I just don't think he's going to separate himself either. I think he's probably the weak link of this team, or at least he was in the playoffs. And then Woody, I like Woody. I've really liked the tape I've seen from him in the past. I was a little bit more underwhelmed when I watched him in the playoffs. I think in general, this bot lane just wasn't what I thought it was going to be. This team really focused a lot through the top side of the map. And I think generally that was good for PSG. That's where your best players are located, so you should play through them. But if you want to play through bot lane, I think you're going to struggle a bit more. And that's just not really something that I want to say about a team that I expect to be able to get out of play-ins. And so, while I do think that they're great, Gen.G and Maple in particular, and then Aji as well. I don't think Aji's a bad player. I was just a little bit lower on him than maybe other people were. I just am not sold on this team being, like, just as good as every Western team. I think that there is a potential that they are, right? Like, this could be a top 14, top 15 team at this tournament, and I'm really not going to be all that surprised. I like the players. I like the overall construction of what happened here, but I just don't know if I trust them to be able to overcome that hump with this bot lane, but if any of the minor region teams are going to be able to do that, it's going to be PSG. I think Gen.G and Maple, like I said, are almost certainly the best jungle mid duo in the play-in stage, and honestly, with the expectations that this team has going into the tournament, they really should be able to get out of the play-ins and get into their main stage. And now moving on to our top 16 teams here at the tournament, and this is where things do get a little bit more interesting, at the very least in my opinion, because now we get to the major region teams. We've gotten all of the minor regions out of the way, I guess depending on what you consider a minor region, memes aside, but top 16 is definitely, I think, where things start to ramp up, even if I think PSG is a strong team. So coming in at the bottom of the top 16, at number 16, it is going to be Team Liquid for me, and I think this might surprise a few people because they are coming in as the number 3 seed from the LCS, and I am including the qualifying teams in this, so both Golden Guardians and BDS are included, and Team Liquid's going to come in below both of them. I just don't have nearly as much confidence in this team as I do in those other two. I think those other two both have really interesting qualities that could give them some major edges in comparison to other teams in this, you know, stage of the bracket, in this little clump that you have here, but I think Liquid is just very inconsistent in terms of what they offer. I've liked what they've been doing, and I like the progression that they've made over the course of the summer split, but I just don't know if it's going to be enough to push them above what I consider to be the weakest of the major region teams. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is Summit in the top lane, Pioshik in the jungle, APA in the mid lane, Yawn at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. Some very recognizable names. A world champion on this team, 2 world champions, I should say, on this team. And Pioshik last year in the jungle, Core JJ obviously in 2017 on Samsung. Just a lot of really, you know, experienced talent, I guess you could say. Summit definitely falls into the experienced talent category, but some youth as well, with Yawn obviously being the rookie that started off the season with Team Liquid, and APA joining midway through the summer split, or getting promoted, I should say, midway through the summer split, and really being an upgrade to that spot. Liquid definitely has some positives. I think there are definitely some reasons to believe that this team could outperform this ranking, but there's also some reasons to believe they won't. Let's go ahead and go over it. The positives, or the upside for this team, really comes from the top side of the map, and it's basically what I've talked about with Liquid all year long. Up until this point, Summit and Pioshik on the top side of the map are incredibly talented players that are very aggressive and oftentimes can be either a super big plus for the team or a super big minus. I've consistently seen Summit power ranked as the #1 top laner coming out of the LCS, and I hate to say it, but that's just not the tape that he has shown over the course of this year. It really is just not who he has been. He's had a couple of really great games. I'm going to be entirely honest, his lane stats are dominant. He still looks like he should be one of the better top laners, but you watch the tape, and it's just not always there. He has way too many games where he has this gigantic CS lead, he has this gigantic gold lead, and then he just, like, makes this awful, awful play that gives it all over to the enemy team. That wasn't a once or a twice or a 3 times this split. That was like 7 or 8 times this split that we had that exact same circumstance happen. And so I am a little bit lower on Summit than I think a lot of other people are. But is the upside there? Absolutely. He's probably the one, you know, North American top laner that I could genuinely see going up against other Eastern top laners in lane and actually doing well and being able to win. I just don't trust him at all to be able to maintain that lead throughout the entirety of the game, and that's how, like, that's what League of Legends is. You don't get paid to play half of the game, you know what I mean? And so I am a little bit lower on Summit, but again, his upside's ridiculous. If he can just clean up some of the errors like he was doing down the stretch of the regular season, then I think he's going to be fine. A similar thing for Pioshik, who really struggled out the gate in North America. It was basically everything I expected it to be. I got a lot of criticism in my preseason power rankings video for the LCS, putting Pioshik only at number 3 because he was a world champion. How is he not number 1 in the jungle role in the LCS? Well, this is why, because he wasn't this ultra consistent player in the LCK. He had his problems even before joining North America, and he had a great Worlds tournament. I'm certainly not going to take that away from him. He was fantastic in that run, but there was reason to believe that the inconsistencies were only going to get worse when the talent around him also got worse, and that was the case at the beginning of the year, where he really did struggle a lot. He was not good in spring when this team finished 7th. He was not good in the beginning of the regular season in summer, but things started to pick up. He got better and better and better, specifically when APA joined the lineup. It felt like Piotr played off of APA significantly better than he played off of Harry. I don't know if it's a playstyle thing, almost certainly it is, but Piotr was great in the playoffs. He was this team's best player in the playoff run that did end up getting them here to the World Championships, but I just don't know if I can trust him enough to say that he's definitely going to be that guy the whole tournament. If he goes up against really good teams, is he going to have consistent games, game after game after game, or is he going to have a couple of really bad ones here or there? I would bet on the latter, probably a little bit more commonly. Like I said, APA joining this team mid-season, I think he's an upgrade towards Harry by like a considerable margin. He was been really good. He was awesome in Academy, or in Challengers, I should say. He's been just as good here for the main roster, and you know, the really big question mark when it comes to APA is just the fact that he didn't perform all that well in the playoffs. I think you can feel relatively comfortable with the fact that he's a solid player, but how solid? Like, is he going to be good enough to be able to go up against, you know, world-class mid laners like he might have to do in the Swiss stage? Because, you know, they're not in play-ins. They don't get to play these minor region teams. They have to play the best of the best. Is APA going to be able to hold his own against them? I don't know. He's had so little time at this top level that it's definitely a concern. Same thing for Jan, although I feel a little bit more comfortable in Jan. I think he's a really solid player that just has a lot of the phases of the game down. Very good team fighter, very consistent. Love him on these late game picks. Can be a little bit inconsistent when his support, KoreJJ, isn't playing well, but that's not entirely his fault. When he has the resources around him, he does well. And then Core, not really the best year of his career, although I still think he's underrated, which is crazy to say that KoreJJ is underrated, but people have kind of jumped off the Core bandwagon. I still think he's a more than fine support at the LCS level. He's a top 3 guy there pretty easily, in my opinion, even though everybody has kind of given up on him, but I think he's solid. I think he's going to be fine at this tournament. I'm not really as worried about Jan and Core. They were kind of the stability of this team over the course of this year, where Someone and Piotr were the upside. When they would win, the team would often dominate and win. Jan and Core were often the ones that were put on weak side and given the opportunities to just kind of survive, and they were good in most of their games, and so I'm really not super concerned with them, but if Piotr and APA can step up and be really solid, that's going to be a positive. If Summit can just capitalize on the good moments and kind of eliminate some of the bad ones, I think that's going to be huge for them. But to expect all of this to happen against the best teams in the world when it wasn't realistically happening all that regularly against LCS teams is just kind of a crazy ask for me. And so they're going to come in at the bottom of these Western teams, or I should say of these major region teams, at the number 16 spot, right near the bottom of C tier. And then moving on to number 15 here in the power rankings, this was certainly an interesting spot to have because we still have our qualifier teams left in the kind of pool of teams on this top 15, and so it was very difficult to kind of rank where I wanted to put them, but maybe a little bit obviously we're going to have one above the other, which might give away where I expected that series to go. But coming in at number 15 for me, it is going to be Team BDS. They are going to come in at the number 15 spot, which a lot of people might see as too low. I think a lot of people, I should say, are probably expecting them to be able to beat Golden Guardians, but maybe shockingly, I don't have them listed above them in these rankings. They are going to come in at number 15. I still like this team a bit. I'm not nearly as confident in them as I am in a lot of the other teams, including North American teams at this tournament. I think that they certainly have their problems, and I think they certainly have ways to get around them, but this team is largely inexperienced, and, you know, this org is happy to be here, but are they going to be able to make the most of it? I genuinely don't know. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Adam in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Crowny at AD carry, and Labrov at support. A lot of these players had big breakout years, and I think rightfully so deserve to be treated very, you know, well in comparison to maybe some of the minor region teams that we've talked about up until this point. But it's also worth noting that BDS is in the midst of what I would consider the weakest stretch of the year for them. They were not very good in summer. They were okay, but they were fine. They were an average team in the LEC in summer. They end up, you know, winning the series that they need to get into Worlds or to get into the Worlds qualifier, but they didn't really do much outside of that in the last couple of months, and so there's reason to believe that they're not in great form at the current moment, and that might carry over into a best of 5 that really has your entire season on the line. And so we can talk about some of the positives, but it is worth noting that at first, like, even with the positives on this team, they really haven't been there over the past couple of weeks, and it certainly is something to be concerned about. But let's start with the players that I like the most. I think probably consensus the best player on this team at this point is probably Crowny, although I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. We'll talk about that in a second, but Crowny's a very good player. He's very solid, again, he's kind of the embodiment of what we were talking about before, where he really had a breakout year, really solidified himself as maybe the best AD carry in Europe at the current moment, but he's really not been his best self over the past couple of weeks, and that definitely is something that is at the very least concerning. He was not very good in the summer split. His group stage performance was very poor in comparison to what he had thrown out over the rest of the year, but he was a big reason why this team did end up making finals in the spring split, and so I certainly don't want to count him out. He gets a pretty good rating in terms of 11th at this tournament at AD carry because I do trust him quite a bit as a player, and I think he'll be fine, especially in comparison to who he's going to be going up against, but I'm not sold that he's going to be this, like, top-tier AD carry like some people might think he will be. Adam is probably the player that I actually have the highest expectations for at this tournament. Adam, in my opinion, has been BDS's best player over the course of this year. As much as I do like Crowny, Adam has really separated himself as a player at the LEC level. And you can say what you want about Adam, not only as a player, but, you know, off the Rift or whatever as well. But on the Rift, he's ridiculously talented, and he has been able to show that basically everywhere that he's been. Wasn't very good on BDS's first stint, but, you know, spending some time in the ERLs, coming back up with a team that is definitely better and more suited to play around him. He was arguably the most impactful top laner in the LEC this year. I don't have him ranked as such, but, you know, I think he's still very, very solid, and I think he's definitely a positive towards this team. And I think if BDS is going to overperform this ranking, if they are going to be able to win that qualifier series, it's probably going to be Adam and Crowny, because I do think that they are the biggest swing points for this team. If they can play like they had in the spring split, then this team is absolutely going to win that series. If they play like they did in the summer series or the summer split, I'm not nearly as confident. But you've got some young players mixed in with some veterans here. Lebrov, more of a veteran at this point. Kind of crazy to say that considering, you know, he's still relatively young, but coming over from Vitality, you know, finally getting an opportunity to play outside of that org that just seems to be completely cursed. And he's kind of rehabilitated what was a really good reputation for him before last year. Obviously, 2022 was a disaster in a lot of ways for Vitality, but Lebrov was looked at as a very strong support, and there was a reason he was considered a good support for a super team last year, and that's kind of carried back in here to BDS. I don't necessarily think he's a superstar. I think he's just a very solid support for this level. He's had superstar games at the LEC level, but it's just not really been consistent enough, and he's another player that I think has really kind of taken a dip in terms of form in the recent weeks, but I like Lebrov. I don't think he's a disaster. Where I have more question marks is going to be the jungle mid duo, Sheo and Nuke. They were the questions going into the split for a lot of people. I feel more comfortable in Sheo. I like Sheo a lot. I think that he's shown basically everything that he needed to show in the LEC this year. He's been very consistent. Not a superstar, not somebody that's going to go out and just dominate games, you know, get the super big CS lead and carry team fights and do all that. He's not that kind of player, but he's a great facilitator, and he's perfect for what this BDS team wants to accomplish at this level. And then there's Nuke. Nuke's been playing, ironically, a lot better as of late. I think he's actually playing the best he's ever played in the LEC. I think that this is a player that I personally wrote off. I know a lot of other people also wrote off. Wasn't great in his time on Schalke. I didn't love him last year on BDS. I just thought he was going to be a low-tier mid laner at the LEC level for his career, but he easily had a breakout year, and I think I'm very happy for him. There are concerns about whether or not that's going to be sustainable. He gets a lot of attention from this team, and I do think that that is something worth noting, although if he does get that in, you know, at Worlds as well, I'm not going to say that he can't maximize and capitalize on that. I do think that the mid lane matchup in that Worlds qualifying series is certainly going to be an intriguing one to watch, and I'm not counting Nuke out in that matchup by any means, but I've been calling Nuke a question mark all year, and all he's done is prove me wrong on that front. I don't know how much longer I can sit there and question him. I haven't exactly been completely sold that it's entirely sustainable, but the performances have been good, and so I at the very least have to take that into account. But for BDS, they have the tools, they have the things that they need in order to beat Golden Guardians and to get into the play-in stage and to be the best team in the play-in stage, but they need to be able to show that they can get back there, because the team that was, you know, playing in the summer split, the team that was playing in the group stage of the summer playoffs, like, that's not good enough to get to that spot. They need to get to where they were a couple of months ago. If they can do that, they're definitely talented enough to be able to kind of get where they want to go, which is the main stage of Worlds, the Swiss stage of Worlds. But for now, there are definitely a few too many question marks for me to say that they're definitely going to be able to get there. And then moving on to number 14 in this list, we just talked about one of the, I guess, Worlds Qualifying Series teams. It's probably apropos and fair that we go for the next one here. Coming in at number 14, it is going to be Golden Guardians. I have them coming in as the third best North American team at this tournament, which is not their seeding coming into this tournament. They are coming in as the number 4 seed in the LCS, and so I think some people are going to be confused by this, but you really won't be if you watch the LCS over the course of this year. This team had been the best team outside of Cloud9 in North America for every single week, basically, up until the final week of the season. The finals, basically the Final Four matchup against Team Liquid, where they just couldn't get the job done. They obviously got upset in the upper bracket by NRG as well, who we will talk about later, but I still believe in Golden Guardians, and I still believe that a lot of the tape that we saw over the course of this year is translatable. I don't exactly love the meta that they had to play in the playoffs, and I think in general, a lot of the players on teams like NRG and Team Liquid had very out-of-pocket good performances in ways that I just don't know if it's entirely sustainable. Players like Pioshik, in particular, just playing out of their mind, and, you know, I don't really blame Golden Guardians for that. It just wasn't their day on those days, but I still trust this team quite a bit, and as you can see from me ranking them at number 14 and not lower than BDS, I do predict them to be able to win that Worlds Qualifying Series. But let's go ahead and get into why as we talk about this team and what their upside could look like. Their lineup is looking like Licorice in the top lane, River in the jungle, Gory in the mid lane, Stixay at AD carry, and Huhi at support. We've obviously seen this team play internationally before this year as they went to MSI, and I think they impressed a lot of people at that tournament. Not only were they the clear-cut best team to come out of the play-in stage, I really don't even think that's all that disputable. They did relatively well in the bracket stage. They, took a game off of BLG in the play-ins, which was great. They looked tough against JD Gaming, the best team in the world. They didn't take a game, but they looked all right in that series, and then obviously they were okay against Cloud9, a team that I think a lot of people consider to be talent-wise the top of North America, and so Golden Guardians really a team that you have to watch out for. I think they have a couple of players that have continued to grow over the course of this year that do give me confidence and hope that they are going to be able to take down BDS and make the tournament proper, and probably even make the main stage as well if they do get into that Worlds Qualifying Series for the play-ins. But let's talk about the positives for this team. The best player on this team, in my opinion, is going to be Huhi in the support position. I've talked about it all year. He has been one of the best players in North America over the course of 2023. Of all of the players, of all of the teams, of every position, Huhi has basically reascended to being an MVP caliber player super consistently. Now, it is a little bit of a concern that he really wasn't all that good in the playoffs. Even in some of the games that they won, he was not really the takeover player that he was in the regular season, but I think there's reason to believe that he's going to be fine, that he's going to be able to make it work again. I think the meta was just very weird, and like I said, jungle pressure was entirely in favor of a lot of the other teams that they ran into in that phase of the playoffs, and I'm just not entirely sold that that's going to be a similar story at Worlds and in the Worlds Qualifying Series, and so Huhi's a massive positive. A big roamer, obviously a former mid laner, but somebody who's been very good in lane, but is mostly known for his team fighting. He's really kind of grown as an all-around player. On 100 Thieves, he was definitely more of a shot call, team fight kind of player, wanted to play a more macro-oriented style, leave lane, really not try to be super dominant in the 2v2, but he's really come around to that style, I think, with Stixay, who has, really stepped up. We'll talk about him next. Stixay has been great over the course of this year. Talk about a complete career resurgence. We can talk about Huhi kind of regenerating his image, and there are quite a few players on this team that have regenerated their image, but I don't think any of them nearly as big as Stixay, right? He was somebody who, at his peak, on CLG back in 2016, people were saying he was a top 10 AD carry in the world, and they were absolutely right at that time. He was a top 10 AD carry in the world for CLG in 2016, but year after year after year, it just felt like things weren't going entirely right. He was okay when he was on CLG before he left to come here to Golden Guardians, but by the time he got here, it felt like the best parts of his career were kind of over, and, he was playing in Academy for a while, and things just, he was a coach for a little bit, things just weren't working out, but he gets another shot this year to play with some, former friends and a former teammate in Huhi, and man, do things go absolutely right. Stixay was, at worst, a top 3 AD carry in North America this year, and has really reestablished himself as everything that he was in his peak, the most aggressive AD carry that North America has, and certainly one that you have to watch. Now, he is going to make some bad plays because of that over-aggression, but for the most part, it's actually just been generally a positive for him, even against very good teams this year. They don't really deal with, it's really hard to deal with very aggressive ADCs because you don't really expect it, but Licorice is the other player on this team that I think you really have to watch out for. He's kind of the third and final redemption story, if you will. Again, everybody had written Licorice off, me included. I took longer, I think, than most people. I kind of held on up until the spring split of this year where I was like, nope, I'm done. I can't You know, the first like 4 games or whatever, I was like, I'm out, I'm done. I want to believe in you, Licorice, but I just can't anymore. And then the second half of Spring Split happened, and then MSI happened, where he was probably one of the best top laners at that tournament. And then he was awesome again in Summer Split. Easily the choice for first team All-Pro in the top lane. Really kind of bodied everybody that he went up against, and he's just generally been a positive for this team all year. So Licorice, Stixxay, Huhi, all positives for Golden Guardians. All players that I think are going to push the upside of this team forward quite a bit. Now, River and Gory generally would be considered positives, but there are some worrying trends with these two players that I think you at the very least have to point out. I think River I'm a little bit more comfortable in. Now, he has shown this kind of behavior before, and Gory has as well, and that's why I'm a little concerned. But River last year, in 2022, remember, looked awesome for Dignitas. They were kind of a little bit of a dark horse in the Spring Split. A lot of people were looking at them very highly, especially after the lock-in tournament, where they did really well. But as the season went on, by the time we hit the end of summer, River felt like he kind of burned out and flamed out a bit after he had gotten traded to Golden Guardians, and he was not nearly the player that he was in spring. Fast forward to this year, 2023, he was amazing again in spring, and while he was still very good in the summer regular season, he was completely outclassed in the jungle position in the playoffs, which is concerning. He got outclassed by Contracts, he got outclassed by Pioshik, and it really did become a problem. That was the biggest gap, in my opinion, in Golden Guardians in the playoffs, was that River just couldn't keep up with other junglers. And if that's going to be a problem in the play-ins as well, that's a concern, because there are good junglers at this tournament. And, you know, going up against Sheo in the World's Qualifying Series, that's a good jungle matchup. And so River's got to get that regular season form back. I trust that he's going to be able to do that because, you know, River's done this. He's been a good player for a while, and so you have to believe that he's going to be fine, but it's certainly something to bring up. And then Gory's fine. I've always been kind of up and down on Gory. I was much lower on him in the Spring Split when everybody had jumped on board and said, oh, he's easily top 2, top 3 mid laner in the LCS, All-Pro, you know, first team All-Pro, everything you could want. I was like, I don't know, man. I wasn't sold. I didn't put him on my All-Pro teams. And then in summer, I did put him on my All-Pro teams by the time a lot of people were like, Gory's maybe a little bit overrated. Maybe we're not in the same boat or whatever. And I'm like, man, I don't know. I just never feels like I'm on the same consensus with everybody else when it comes to this player. I like Gory. I think he's underrated for what he does for this team. I still think he's a solid player and certainly one to keep watch of, but he's not a superstar, and he's certainly not the most consistent. He does a really good job of beating people that he is better than. I think that, you know, there are quite a few mid laners at this tournament that share that trait, but Gory definitely falls into that bracket where I do think he will struggle a bit more against some of the best competition. Now, he's going up against a player in Nuke that I do think he's more talented than. You know, as much as I like Nuke and as much as he had a good year, I think Gory is more mechanically skilled than Nuke. Now, Nuke, I think, plays better with his team, so it's definitely going to be an interesting matchup to talk about, and we'll kind of get into some, you know, previews and stuff when we do my play-in preview video, but for now, I'll just say that I trust Golden Guardians quite a bit. I think players like Gory and River are due for bounce backs, and Licorice, Stixxay, Huhi, they've been great all year long. You know, even in their dark moments, they've been really, really solid. I think a lot of people are looking at recency bias a little bit too much for this Golden Guardians team, and I think they're almost certainly going to overperform what they've done in the recent weeks. And then moving on to our number 13 team in the power rankings. Every team from here on out is guaranteed to be in the main stage. Of course, we already talked about one main stage team, but we had to get the 2 Worlds Qualifying Series teams out of the way after that, so now we're just in Swiss stage teams. These are the 13 teams that I think really have a shot to be interesting. Of course, everybody has been interesting up until this point. We're still in the C tier. I told you it really was the biggest tier, but coming in at number 13 for me, and maybe a little surprising for some people, it is going to be NRG, the number 1 seed and the champions of the LCS in North America. They're going to come in at number 13 for me, which might seem low, but I think this is probably where they should be in the grand scheme of things. This was a miracle run for them, and obviously I'm really not trying to take anything away from what they've been able to do over the course of this year. This team has gotten better when they were CLG in spring. A lot of things really started to go right for that team. Obviously, it didn't work out in the playoffs, but they were still a pretty fun to watch team, and they definitely grew a lot. So they make some changes. They change orgs. They go from CLG to NRG in the mid-season and the kind of transition period. And they change out their bot lane. Instead of Luger and Poom, they go to FBI and Ignar. They pick up FBI from Evil Geniuses, who wants to move in a different direction. And they pick up Ignar from Dignitas, who was just looking to completely change out their roster. And, you know, at the time, I was pretty positive about these changes. I'm a big FBI fan. I have been for a while, but it's worked out even better than I could have ever anticipated. This team went on to do really well in the regular season, to peak at the right time. They were actually struggling quite a bit at the beginning of the summer split. People tend to forget that, but they figured it out. They got into the playoffs with a relatively good seed, and they went on a massive run. They took down Golden Guardians, they took down Team Liquid, and they took down Cloud9 to take the LCS trophy, which I don't think anybody anticipated. They were certainly not the favorites, but for that reason, they still are going to come in a little bit lower than maybe some other teams would in this particular instance, because we do have a year's worth of tape, or at least half a year's worth of tape of these 5 playing together, and there are certainly question marks. I'm not going to sit here and try and pretend that everything was perfect for this team, because it just wasn't. There were certainly some things that you had to be, at the very least, a little bit more concerned about, and so I'm going to bring that up, but there are a lot of things to like, and there's a reason this team did end up winning the title. Let's talk about topside first, because that's the NRG core that they ended up sticking with from the CLG days, starting with Dplus in the top lane. Big Dokes is really on fire right now. I'm actually ranking him a little bit higher than I think a lot of people probably would at this tournament. I like Dplus quite a bit. He's a very aggressive top laner, but I think he really grew as a team player over the course of the last few years. Not that he was ever really bad at that. I'm not going to try to sit here and say that he's ever been a bad weak side top lane player, but I think we all kind of had this idea of Dplus being a little bit more lane dominant, a little bit more focused on winning early. And I think he's really shed that reputation and just become a really good all-around top laner. He's one of the best in the West, in my opinion, and I don't think you're going to hear a lot of people saying that. I think he definitely deserves to be in that conversation. He's kind of grinded his way back to the top of North America, and he's absolutely earned it. He's been fantastic over the course of this year, and he was a big part of that playoff run. He is very underratedly great in the top lane. There are actually quite a few good top laners in the LCS. It's one of the positions that's honestly deeper than it is in a lot of other regions, which is crazy to say for the LCS, but they have a lot of good top laners, a lot of very competent top laners, and Dplus has really stood out above basically all of them, and I think it's been really impressive. I feel a lot of confidence in him to at least be good going into this tournament. However, there are some pieces that I think are a little bit more volatile in terms of what you might be able to get from them. Contracts and Palafox are definitely a little bit more feast or famine in terms of their style. I know I overuse that phrase on this channel, and I do apologize for that. I've tried to weave it out a little bit of my vernacular, but they do apply. Those words definitely apply to Contracts and Palafox. Contracts will have some of the best games you've ever seen, most of them on more facilitating support-oriented junglers, and then, you know, sometimes he'll just completely run it. He'll die 12 times in the first 14 minutes of the game, and you're just like, well, go next, right? He's just very up and down. His downs are significantly better than they have been in past years. That was always what was kind of holding him back from being one of the elite junglers in North America, was just that he had too many bad plays, but he's gotten significantly less of those bad plays, but he's kept a lot of the good plays and a lot of the good momentum that he's able to generate. And like I said, I think he's great on facilitators. Things like the Maokai and the Poppy and the Sejuani, those are really his go-tos that I think have really made him look fantastic over the course of this year. So I like Contracts a bit. And then Palafox, he's kind of been a very sneaky channel darling over the past few years. I've basically put him on the All-Pro team for 4 straight splits now, and this is the first one where he actually got a ton of votes for All-Pro, and so it's good to see that I think the North American fan base and just League in general has finally started to catch up to my love of Palafox and how good I think he's been for this CLG team. However, it's not, you know, of me to just pretend he doesn't have flaws, right? Like, it doesn't make sense for me to sit here and just praise him because I like him as a player. I do like him a lot, and I like his playstyle, and, you know, I think he's a really fun, you know, player and personality for the league, but he's not a perfect player. He can be pretty inconsistent, and that came out a lot over the course of the summer split. A lot more than people were giving him credit for. He had some fantastic games. Some of the best games of his entire career came in summer of 2023, but he had some really bad ones as well, and to pretend like it was just all sunshine and rainbows is just not the case. Now, it kind of was in the playoffs. He really was spectacular during their playoff run. He was a big reason why that team ended up doing super well, and if he's going to continue to get some of the champions that he's really good at, you know, Assassins I think are obviously kind of his forte, but just anything that can play aggressive in the early and mid game, you know, things like the Jace kind of fall into that category as well. I think that's what Palafox really excels on. Now, he's a good team fighter. He's one of the few players in North America that really feels super comfortable bringing out something like the Aurelion Soul, but, you know, for the most part, I want to see him, Contracts, Dplus play something aggressive on the top side of the map and allow bot side to be a little bit more weak side, which is crazy to say, considering how much I'm anti that style typically in the meta right now, but FBI and Ignar have basically perfected it in the LCS. FBI was probably this team's best player in the playoffs. He was so consistent with what they wanted to do. He was consistently winning lane in the isolated 2v2, which is very impressive, and, you know, I think he just continued to grow as a player. He's been underrated for a really long time. People continue to overlook him just because he's not the flashiest player in the world, but he's been one of the best AD carries in the West for, you know, 3-4 years now, and just because people don't want to, I don't know, like his stats, or they want to, you know, praise another player in the league a little bit more, I think FBI often gets a lot of hate comments, at least he does in my videos, and so I want to continue to prop him up. I like FBI as a player, and he continues to be really solid. And Ignar, talk about a re-breakout. I was really low, and I think everybody was, on Ignar going into this split. Things had really not worked out in his last few excursions, if you will. He was horrible on Immortals, he was horrible on Dignitas. It just felt like, you know, Ignar wasn't clicking in the same way that he was. Maybe it was a meta thing, maybe it was just like a phasing out kind of thing, that sometimes you get burnt out mentally and you can't perform at the same level. We've seen it a lot. But coming back to NRG here, you know, getting a team that's a little bit more talented around him, he dominated this year, like this split. He was awesome, especially towards the back half. He still was a little bit questionable at the beginning of the split, as I think a lot of this team was. FBI and Ignar in particular just didn't seem to click immediately. But by the time we hit the end of the summer split, Ignar was a top 3 support in the league. At least that's how he was performing. And he continued that trend into the playoffs, where he continued to play at a very, very high level. And so if he's going to be able to keep that up, if him and FBI have found this really strong 2v2 connection that they can play off of, then this team's going to be very difficult to beat, because Dokla, Contracts, Palafox, they're going to take a lot of resources to shut down. They're not going to be players that you can overlook completely. There's still a lot of question marks about this team, because almost all of these players are almost completely unproven at the World Championships. Contracts has been here before, but it's been almost half a decade since he was here on Cloud9 many, many years ago. FBI obviously has experience. Ignar obviously has experience, but the solo laners do not. Neither of them have ever been to Worlds either. And this is a big test. This team is not going into plans. They're going into the main stage. Do I think they're going to be able to surprise some teams and pick up some wins? Yeah, I think that, you know, I would be surprised if this team went 0-6, but am I expecting them to be, you know, dominant, you know, win a lot of games, be an actual threat to get out of the Swiss stage? Probably not. I just don't think that they're quite in that category just yet for me. I think they could get there, especially if some of those young players or some of the more unproven ones have great tournaments, but I'm going to predict them to be right around the middle of the pack here at number 13. And then moving on to number 12 in these power rankings, we're really starting to get into some teams that I think could make some noise. Maybe not, you know, favorites to get out of the, I guess not group stage, but the Swiss stage or anything like that. Definitely not, you know, teams that I would consider locks for top 8 or anything. Obviously, we're still at number 12, but teams that I think realistically could, you know, win some games against some really good teams at this tournament, even if they're not necessarily going to be favorites. And really kicking that off, coming in at number 12 for me, just barely, I would say, in that little cluster of teams, is going to be Mad Lions, the number 3 seed from the LEC, a team that has sure had their ups and downs over the course of this year. The consistency has certainly not been there nearly to the extent of a lot of the teams that are going to be listed above them, which is why they're still here at number 12, but there were points at this season where they looked a lot better than this, and I do think they have the talent to be able to kind of surpass these rankings and kind of get themselves into a better position. I just don't know if I have the faith in the team to be able to do that. Now, I've talked about this a lot on the channel over the past few years. I think the reputation of Mad Lions being these international underperformers, these international chokers, I don't think that's necessarily fair to them. Yes, they've certainly had their problems. They're the only Western team to not make it out of groups, or not make it out of play-in stage, I should say, and they've done it twice. They did it in 2021, or 2020, I should say, and they did it again last year in 2022. Worth noting that at least last year they were knocked out by another major region team in Evil Geniuses, but I digress. Still being put in that position in the first place is super unfortunate, but you have to remember this was a team that 2 years ago got out of groups at Worlds, got into the quarterfinals of the World Championships, and so it's not like they've had zero success. They were in the semifinals of MSI, you know, 2 years ago as well, and so Mad Lions knows that they can win. They just need to get back to some of those winning ways, but is this the roster to do it? Let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Chasey in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Niski in the mid lane, Karzi at AD carry, and Hillisang at support. Some good and some bad with this lineup, as I've said with a lot of the teams that are in this C tier that are kind of clumped into the middle here, teams that I think, you know, can beat a lot of teams, but also aren't necessarily going to be major favorites to make a ton of noise in the grand scheme of things at Worlds. But I think Mad has a little bit of upside in terms of the creativity and the playmaking that a lot of these players are kind of known for. I think when you talk about Mad, you simply have to talk about jungle mid first. There really is no other place to start, because the team does run so much through those two players, and I will say not as much recently, but I think that could be a little bit of a reason why this team has struggled a tad bit more, which I'll just say now. Elyoya and Niski were the heartbeat of this team, not only last year when this team honestly overperformed all expectations in the summer split, was able to make the World Championships even if they didn't do all that well there. Niski played fantastic in the regular season, and Elyoya played out of his mind to kind of really push that team over the top, and you know, I think that a lot of people kind of forgot how good Niski was at League of Legends when he kind of reemerged on Mad, and then it was basically the same story this year. They made back-to-back finals in the winter and in the spring split, even winning the spring split, coming back from a down 0-2 to reverse sweep Team BDS, which is obviously great, but a lot of that was Elyoya and Niski continuing to play at a super high level. If these two can kind of get some of those resources back and really start to feel more comfortable as main carries of the team again, I honestly do feel like Mad Lions is going to level up. I think this is the biggest swing point for the team at this tournament, and one of the biggest swing points for any team at this tournament. Now, playstyle-wise, if you're not familiar with Mad, is going to be Elyoya as a little bit more of this, I don't want to say facilitator, but kind of like a facilitating carry. It's a very weird role that he ends up having. He gets a lot of resources and a lot of attention from his laners, but it's in the sense of he's consistently trying to take fights to get his laners ahead. And so it's kind of this hybrid playstyle that he's really adopted over the past couple of months. He used to really just be a carry jungler, but him and Niski have really kind of changed their styles for each other, and I think it's really made them a lot better. Elyoya, I think, has grown a lot as a player. And there have been times for most of this year, honestly, that I've called Elyoya the best jungler in Europe. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that now, but he's certainly, you know, in that conversation. And Niski, obviously more so known as the shove and roam, facilitating, you know, very active type of mid laner that isn't going to be a dominant carry in his own right. However, again, he's kind of shifted his playstyle to match the rest of this team, and I think he's been a lot more active in terms of having the team play around him and play around his pressure. And I do think that that's where Mad Lions was at their best earlier this year, was when basically the entire game plan was Elyoya and Niski getting out on the map as a duo and trying to make plays. And wherever they are, that's your pressure part of the map. If you want to play towards the top side, play for Heralds. You can have Chasey play something that can push up super early and actually be aggressive. If you want to play for Dragons, if you want to try to get your AD carry, your hyper carry ahead, you can play for Carzzy, but all of it is going to run through that jungle mid. I personally believe that that's where they're at their strongest, but again, that's kind of something that they've moved away from as we've gone throughout the year. Carzzy and Hylissang have gotten more and more attention as we've gone throughout the year, and Carzzy has, to his credit, made that worth it. He has been really good. Summer was probably his best split, ironically enough, with how Mad Lions played. From an individual perspective, he was really consistent. He was a really good carry, both early and late game. If you're going to get the best version of Carzzy and Hylissang, especially in lane, while you're, you know, starting to transition back to some more Elyoya and Niski stuff, perhaps getting them back on the same page, then that's the best version of Mad Lions that you could possibly get. Now, are those two things possible together? We haven't seen them, and so you have to believe that they're going to, unfortunately, have to pick one or the other. It's going to be interesting to see where they go, but Carzzy has been playing a lot better as of late, even if he is a super aggressive AD carry and can sometimes get himself into trouble. Same thing for Hylissang, super aggro. You know, he's the poster child for feast or famine support-style gameplay where he's going to go and try to make major plays every single game, whether he's ahead or behind, and it's either going to win or lose his team the game. He's been a major positive for Mad over the course of this year, one of the best supports in the region. That feast or famine style, as is typical for Hylissang, has just been very good for his teams. It's given them a lot of opportunities, and then you've got Chasey in the top lane, who is certainly an interesting discussion. He was someone who I really had no expectations for going into the year, and he's both exceeded and disappointed those expectations at different points in time. He was phenomenal basically in every best of 5 that this team played up until the summer split. But in summer, he was awful in the best of 5 series. He was really bad in the best of 5s in the season finals in particular for Mad, and I think that was a really big reason why they're coming in at number 3 and not as a number 2 seed or even higher from the LEC, is because Chasey just had a really bad tournament there. Now, like I said before, he was really good in the best of 5s in basically every other split. That was actually where he started to level up. It was the regular season that was a little bit more of a question mark. So if he can get that confidence and that comfort back as we go into more of a high-pressure stage, which kind of always felt like his jam, then I think this team is actually in a relatively decent spot. I think they're going to be surprising in how good they are to some people. However, if they don't get that, if Chasey is the version of himself that we've seen most recently, if Elyoya and Niski are the versions of themselves that we've seen most recently, then I don't think this team is going to be very good. They haven't been very good in recent weeks, or at least in comparison to, you know, the good teams at Worlds here and the other good Western teams. I think Mad would probably fall in these rankings if that was the case, and so it's certainly something to keep an eye out for. I think this team has some of the highest variance of any of the teams that we've talked about, certainly more so than teams like NRG and Golden Guardians and BDS that we've talked about in the previous rankings, but I do think their upside is even higher than this number 12, and I don't think you're going to hear that from a lot of analysts. And then moving on to number 11 in my power rankings, just outside of the top 10. We're really starting to hit some of the better teams at this tournament. We're nearing the top of the seeds here. We're still not quite there. I told you it was a big one, but coming in at number 11 for me, it is going to be Fnatic. They are going to come in at number 11. I think this is a relatively fair placement considering how their year has gone up until this point. I think that they have proven a lot over the course of the last few months, pretty much completely proving that they deserve to be here and are one of the better Western teams at this tournament with the form that they've played in, especially recently. However, I would be remiss not to mention that I do have individual concerns with a lot of the players on this team. There's not a single player on this team that has given an entire year of great performances in 2023. A lot of them have had, I think all of them have had really great moments when they've been playing well, but can they all play well at the same time? That's definitely going to be a question mark. So let's go ahead and get into it. First of all, their roster is looking like Oscar Rinin back in the top lane here, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Trimby at support. Good players, like really talented players that have all played at a super high level at, like I said, points in this season. Now, the inconsistency is definitely real with Fnatic. There's a reason this was a bottom 3 team for both of the first 2 splits of the season. Both winter and spring, they were, you know, I believe 9th and then 8th, respectively, in those splits. And so, not ideal in terms of the outcome that you ended up getting from them, but you know, they made some changes. They brought in a new bot lane, which I think definitely helped. This bot lane has been a major upgrade towards what they were playing at the beginning of the year with basically anybody that they had in there, Reckless plus whomever, right? Noah has been a really nice upgrade to Reckless. I think that his mechanical skill has definitely been something that Fnatic has wanted to play around a tad bit more. His consistency in the late game is just something that they didn't have before. Reckless, while he's a really good player, and honestly, I still think he was underrated for this Fnatic team, he certainly wasn't the problem. Noah is much more of a player that can be a solution, right? Where even if the rest of the team isn't playing well, Noah has the kind of skill and mechanical prowess to be able to team fight and, you know, 3v3 skirmish his way out of bad situations for his team, or at least he has been able to do that at the LEC level. The problem with Noah has just always been the aggressiveness, right? You want to see a little bit more of that killer attitude coming in from him. I don't know if it's nerves, I don't know if it's just not his playstyle, but he was the KDA king in the regular season for a reason. It's because he wasn't really taking these major fights. He was kind of sitting back, waiting for his opportunity, and then taking that when it was at its absolute best. And while that can be a really nice style, and it's certainly something that Fnatic has practiced with all year long, I would say Reckless is a similar player, just in kind of a different way. I think that Noah would really... I think he would benefit this team more for him to play a little bit more forward, because I do believe he is the most talented mechanical player on this team, and I think if he was a little bit more aggressive, especially because Trimby is a pretty aggressive support player in the early laning phase, I do think that that could be a positive for the team, but Noah is still good for this team overall, and then Trimby in the support position, obviously just kind of stepping in, really solidifying a support spot that had been a turnstile for Fnatic all year long up until that point. Really like Trimby and what he's been able to do for Fnatic. He's not a perfect player. I think a lot of people like to look at him as, you know, this universally great support. He's definitely got his flaws. He's kind of the opposite of Noah in the sense of, I think Trimby's a really good early game player. I think that his laning is fantastic, and he's really smart about where to make early roams and to move around the map. He's really good at generating leads for his jungler in particular. That was something that he excelled on when he was on Rogue and when he was on Koi. But on Fnatic here, he's been given a little bit of a different role. He is a little bit more of a protector, I would say, for Noah to get him into the mid to late game. And that's fine as well. He still is going to be aggressive. He still is going to try to make plays. And he does have more of a killer instinct in him in terms of, you know, when to engage and when to do things like that. I still like him a bit more on things like Enchanters. I think that, you know, the Engager meta has been fine for him, but I like him in Enchanter metas. I think that he's one of the better Enchanter players in the West, and you know, I think that would be an interesting thing for them to go to. I do think it fits their playstyle to potentially play more, but they haven't really shown that, so it's going to be interesting. Noah and Trimby are just a solid bot lane. I think that they're, you know, good for this level, not dominant for this level. And then you've got Razork and Humanoid. You got to pair them together as basically a duo here, because that's kind of how they have to be interpreted. Either they both play well or they both play really poorly. They play off of each other a lot, and that can be both a good and a bad thing. Humanoid has run into a lot of trouble over the past 2 years, and more than that, honestly. Back to his time on Mad Lions, back to his time on Splice. Humanoid's run into a lot of problems in his career, putting himself too far forward in situations where he doesn't necessarily have the tempo and the map pressure to do so. He just really likes to play aggressive in lane phase, and that can be exploited by really good teams, as we saw, not only for a lot of this year, but for basically all of last year leading up until the World Championships. Now, if you want a reason to be excited about Humanoid, first of all, he's played really well over the past couple of weeks. In the season finals, he was the most consistent member of this team. You can talk about, you know, him not necessarily being the highest of highs, but that's not what you need from Humanoid. You just need him to be good enough. He was playing a lot of Syndra, playing a lot of these more stable mid lane matchups that he can be useful in both mid and late game, and I think that that was a really big positive. As long as he can continue to stick to that, that's going to be good, but even more of a encouraging factor is just how good he has been at Worlds in particular, and how much he has stepped up when he has gotten to this tournament. It's always been the tournament where he has performed at his best, in my opinion, as a player, and if you're getting that version of Humanoid like you got last year, like you got a couple of years ago on Mad Lions, I think that's really, really good. I think that's always going to be a positive if a player can play their best at a tournament like this. And then for Razork, again, another player who's in really great form right now. He was awesome in the season finals, probably the biggest reason why this team ended up making the finals of that season finals. However, again, Razork is really feast or famine as a player in the sense of he falls into the very traditional, at this point, jungle trope of being really bad at playing from behind, right? There are a lot of junglers in the world right now that are bad at playing from behind. Razork is unfortunately one of them. It's just kind of that meta where if you're not able to generate early leads, it can be difficult to get yourself back into the game. I think that has been a problem for Fnatic, is their early game is so important, specifically for this jungle mid duo, and so if they can continue to generate those leads like they were able to domestically, that's going to be fine. But if you're going into a team like JD Gaming in the main stage and they're able to get this big lead on you, I don't know if I trust Fnatic to be able to pull that back out, and so those are the concerns, right? And then you've got Oscar on the top side. Oscar's really good. He has really impressed me throughout this year. I'm not going to say he's a superstar. I certainly don't think he's going to be the player that Fnatic wants to play through. If anything, they have proven that they don't want to play through top lane at any point in this season, really. I thought they brought in Oscar in to replace Wunder because he was a more carry-oriented player, but they essentially just converted him to the Wunder style and made him just play very similarly. Now Oscar has adapted to that and has played really well in that role. However, it's just kind of an interesting thing. This team seems to show no desire to want to play through the top side of the map, and so that's definitely something to keep in mind. But Oscar's a good player. You know, Wunder is gone. He's not even the sub for this team moving into the World Championships, so it's going to be Oscar's position. It seems that the surgery went well and that, you know, everything is okay, which is great. You know, him filling back in is fantastic, but it is going to be something worth noting that he's really not going to be a power point on the map because Fnatic doesn't really allow him to be for the most part, and so I like this team. I think they're talented, and I certainly think they're more talented than a lot of the Western teams that we've gone over in this Group C up until this point. However, I think playstyle-wise, I just don't know if I trust them to be able to get a ton done in comparison to maybe some of the better teams at this tournament. I do think that they have the upside to be one of the more interesting kind of Western teams, to be an upset factor, especially if both Razork and Humanoid are playing well, which I definitely think is a possibility, but I just don't know if I can confidently say that that's definitely going to happen. So for me, they come in at number 11 as kind of a middle ground of those two decisions. And now we have finally reached the top 10 here in my primer video. We've gone through over half of the teams, and so it is time to get into the top 10 teams at the tournament, in my opinion. And coming in at the bottom of this and at the top of C tier, we're finally done. I know it was so many teams in that C tier, but coming into the top of C tier and at number 10 for me, it is going to be Cloud9. They are going to be the number 1 team coming out of North America for me, even though they are coming in as the number 2 seed in the LCS. And that was because obviously that big upset happened in the finals with them losing to NRG. But I wouldn't predict that NRG would be a team that would be able to perform better than Cloud9 on an international level. And a lot of that, honestly, for me, is not team playstyle, it's not team cohesion. It's unfortunately just individual talent. I believe so much in some of the individual players on Cloud9 to be able to perform at a very high level, as you can see from some of the player rankings, that I just simply have to put them in my top 10. You know, you can make the argument that a team like Fnatic or even Mad Lions could perform better, but we'll get into some arguments why I think Cloud9 deserves to be up here in just a second. But their lineup is looking like Fudge in the top lane, Blabber in the jungle, Eminus in the mid lane, Berserker at AD carry, and Sven at support. Basically, the most talented team that I could think of coming out of the West that we have talked about up until this point. That really is the reason that they are here is because I think they have two individual players that, you know, are potentially world-class, and that's really hard to do at this level. I think you have two players that make a really interesting argument for being some of the more interesting players in their roles if they can perform at their highest level. Let's start off with the one that I talked about in my top 20 players video, or at least as an honorable mention, Berserker in the AD carry position. Obviously, I said in that video there's a reason that I consider him so highly. Not only has he absolutely dominated the LCS, and not only has he absolutely proven that he is the best player in the region at the current moment, but if the rumors are to be believed, he is at the very least generating interest from top LCK teams for 2024, and there is a reason for that. And that's because he does more with the resources that he is given than basically any other AD carry that I've seen in the world this year. Now, yes, again, it is against a lower level of competition because he's not playing in the LCK, he's not playing in the LPL, but would I really be all that surprised if next year he, you know, goes to one of those top regions, the LCK or the LPL, gets on a better team and, like, goes to Worlds and performs like a top 5 to 10 player in the world? I'm really not going to be all that shocked. That's the kind of player Berserker is mechanically, you know, and really just as an all-around player. He is fantastic, and coming in at number 9 in my rankings is certainly not meant to discredit that. There are obviously some fantastic AD carries at this tournament, a lot of them, basically all of them. I think I covered 7 of them in my top 20 video, whether as honorable mentions or on the list themselves. AD carry is just a super stacked position at the top right now, so Berserker comes in relatively low on that list, but I mean, realistically, if he was a top 7 to 8, you know, even top 6 AD carry at this tournament, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. He probably won't perform like that because, again, the team just might not have the talent around him to be able to, you know, boost that up. But Berserker is legit world-class, and I know a lot of people don't watch the LCS, but if you don't, you gotta take my word for it. Like, I know it's hard to believe that a player in North America can be that good, but Berserker truly is that good. And then you've got Blabber on the other side, and I've been in Blabber's camp for basically his entire career. I have pounded the table for him as a top 10 jungler in the world, and I'm going to continue to pound the table as a top 10 jungler in the world. He comes in at number 8. I don't necessarily think that he's better than Berserker. I do think that the jungle position isn't nearly as stacked at the top as you probably saw in my top 20 list, where I only had 2 junglers even mentioned in the video, but I do think Blabber's a really good player that is just so versatile. Obviously, we know he can carry, we know he can play things like the Kindred or the Olaf that obviously he's become very famous for, but he's a great facilitator, still one of the best in the West with the Maokai, with the Sejuani, with whatever you really need him to play. He's just a super all-around player, and, you know, Blabber is somebody who I think is one of the few junglers specifically in the West that has the mechanical skill and has the early game pathing ability to go up against Eastern junglers and still actually hold his own. I really believe a lot in Blabber as a player, and I think he's proven that over the course of the years, right? He's been fantastic at Worlds. I know that he doesn't necessarily get that reputation because Cloud9 hasn't had the individual success that maybe you would want, but his individual performances have been spectacular and really everything you could ask for in that department. It's everybody else on this team that I do have question marks about, and I think rightfully so. The player that I have the least amount of question marks about is probably Sven. You probably know what you're going to get out of him. However, it is worth noting that he has played poor as a support internationally ever since he role swapped into that position. I don't know if that's a playstyle thing. He does get away with a lot of very aggressive moves in the LCS that he probably just doesn't get away with nearly as much internationally against better teams, but he has the fundamentals to be fine. He's a very good laner as a support. Him and Berserker do such a consistent job of being able to generate leads in the 2v2. Really where Sven has run into problems internationally has been in the mid-game skirmishes where he's just out of position, trying to get wards in a position that, you know, is exploitable in a lot of different scenarios. And so if he can clean that up, which I think is a clean-upable trait, then I think he's going to be fine. He does basically everything else well. He's a good team fighter. I think he probably had his most consistent year as a support here in 2023. And then you've got Fudge. Let's talk about Fudge next. I like Fudge. He didn't have a very good summer split, and that's definitely something that I've taken into account. I was really high on Fudge coming out of spring. I thought he was the best player on Cloud9 from a performance perspective in the regular season in the spring split going into MSI. I thought he was arguably the best top laner in the West. He really was performing at that level. It felt like he got better every single split. But summer was a little bit of a drop-off. First of all, he didn't get played for nearly as much, which is certainly something that you have to take into account. That, you know, he was weak side a tad bit more, but even when he did get resources, it didn't feel like he was nearly as strong with them. And he was losing 1v1s, which was something that he just didn't really do all that much in the spring split. So there certainly are concerns with Fudge, but again, he's got the talent to be fine. We've seen what he can do at his absolute best, and at his absolute best, he deserves to be listed pretty highly, especially in comparison to a lot of the other Western top laners. And then you've got Eminus in the mid lane. Now, Eminus is such a swing point for this team because when he's playing well, he looks fantastic. And honestly, I do think he's better than a lot of people give him credit for, which is crazy to say. It feels like reputation and public perception is turned on Eminus for kind of confusing reasons. Obviously, he's a very volatile player. He likes to play carries. He likes to play champions specifically that can move around the map. I remember back in both his European days and, you know, in his academy days, he played a lot of Vex, things like that. You know, Akali obviously is in his champion pool, but he's more so moved towards these early game power spikers that are super meta right now, like Tristana, like Jace. Things that want to win lane and want to be able to establish pressure early so that they can affect the mid game super heavily. I do think that works for this team because Blabber is such an active jungler in the early game, but Eminus isn't always the most consistent player. He's going to have games where he looks really good, and he's able to dominate lane, and he's able to get that lead, and he's able to move around the map, and he's going to have other games where he's not able to get that lead, but he continues to try to make the same plays, and so he just puts his team in pretty poor positions, and that can obviously be even worse than a player that, you know, just loses gracefully. He doesn't necessarily do that, and so, yes, I do agree, there are concerns with Eminus, especially going to an international tournament, but he does have upside, and I think more so than people give him credit for. If he were to come into this tournament and play at a super high level and, you know, be very active and work well with Blabber and enable Berserker, I'm not going to be entirely surprised, but it is a prediction because it certainly wasn't something that he showed in the finals, and it certainly wasn't something that he showed all year long. Now, he had some great moments. I actually think his regular season in summer was the best we've ever seen Eminus, and so I do have faith that it's, you know, possible for him to be able to play well. It's just going to be a question mark, but you know, as for the team as a whole, I really believe in Blabber and Berserker individually as players. I think they're going to stack up even just fine against some of the better players at this tournament. And I think that's not really your cause of concern, right? It's the ancillary pieces and Cloud9's playstyle as a whole, which is very cocky, very aggressive. They're super used to being able to get away with some very, you know, risky plays because they're just able to outplay their opponents. Now, they've shown the ability to be able to clean that up, but you've got to be able to do that for a whole tournament if you're going to want to be able to win games. If Cloud9 plays like they played against NRG, or hell, even against teams that they beat, you know, NRG when they beat them, or, you know, Golden Guardians in the finals last split, if they play like that against JD Gaming and Gen.G, they're not going to be able to take those games because Gen.G and JDG aren't going to let them get away with a lot of the things they got away with there. However, if they kind of capitalize on some of the resources that they have on their team, if they play around their best players and play maybe a more controlled style, I do think Cloud9 could be a team to watch at this tournament, which is why they're coming in at number 10 and in the top 10 for me. And now we get to move on into our number 9 team, and this is going to be a tier jump. Like I said before, number 10, Cloud9, was the end of C tier. We are jumping in to my B tier teams as we move into this next section. How I would describe the B tier in comparison to the C tier teams were all teams that I expected to be main stage caliber, to be Swiss stage caliber, even if they were starting in the play-ins, but not teams that I would expect to be able to make the most amount of noise, and probably not teams that I would expect to be able to make it out of the Swiss stage into the bracket stage, into the top 8. I just didn't see that coming, but these 9 teams I think are the 9 that you really should be looking at as the potential teams to be getting out of the Swiss stage at the tournament this year. These are the 9 that I think have the best shot in comparison to everybody else. Of course, only 8 will get out, but it will probably be 8 of these 9 teams. I don't know who's going to miss it, but I guess I'll give my prediction here, because coming in at number 9, it is going to be G2 Esports. I do like G2 quite a bit, but I just can't justify putting them in my top 8. It's very, very close, but this team has been a little bit inconsistent over the course of this year, and I'm very high on just basically every team coming out of the LCK and the LPL, and that means that the number 1 Western team for me does come in at number 9 on my power rankings. This is probably going to be one of the lower ones that you see across a lot of, I guess, tier lists and things like that, at least from what I've noticed, mostly, and maybe I'm just talking out my ass here, but mostly because I think a lot of the popular streamers and analysts that talk about this are European, and so they are obviously going to be a little bit more biased towards G2, but I think I'm just really not as into this team. They're really, really good, and they're definitely the best Western team. They're the only Western team that I have above C tier, and so clearly they're the best team on that side of the world, but I just don't really know if I believe in them enough to say that they're going to be able to be one of the top 8 teams at this tournament and get out of the main, or of the Swiss stage. I almost said the group stage again. It's going to be so hard to break that habit, but there are reasons to believe that they can do it. That's why they're in this tier in the first place. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. There's a lot to like about this team, mostly because they've just kind of dominated the LEC, especially recently. The only split that they didn't win this year was the spring split, the middle split, in the middle of the year, and even then they ended up losing to eventual champions Mad Lions, and, you know, you could probably tell that they were trying a bit more in that split. They were taking a few more risks in draft and not necessarily, you know, trying to play the most dominant style that they could, because it didn't really matter. They had already qualified for everything they needed to qualify for. They were already going to MSI, and they had already qualified for the season finals by winning the winter split. They only then went on to win the summer split as well, and then, of course, win the season finals as well to get the #1 seed, but they're really, really dominant, and I think a lot of it has been a lot of these players stepping up after poor years, specifically this bot lane, which in my opinion has been the best part of this team and has been the focal point for how they want to run a lot of their aggressive plays, specifically Mickey X. I talked about this in my top 20 players video. He was the one European player that I did give an honorable mention to in that video. I think Mickey is definitely the best player in Europe right now, at least with how he's performed in 2023, and it's really good to be able to say that, because I really was not a fan of his 2022. I talked about it a ton. When he signed with Excel in the summer split, I was so excited. I thought it instantly turned them into one of the more interesting teams, a top 3-ish team in the LEC, and while at times it definitely looked like that was going to be the case, it was almost in spite of Mickey, who was kind of a disaster last year. He really was playing way too aggressive, putting himself and his team in really bad positions. He led the league in deaths by like a gigantic margin, and it backed up on tape. When you're going to be making a lot of aggressive plays like that, they have to at the very least be calculated aggression, and it just wasn't for Mickey, and I think he was a big reason why Excel ended up not making Worlds last year, and so I was concerned about what was going to happen, especially because he's pairing up with Hansama, who was coming off of another, you know, his first really bad year on Team Liquid in North America, but, you know, even like I said in the preseason analysis, I expected these two to be able to bounce back, because that's just what G2 does to a lot of these players, is they get the best out of them. That's what G2 has done to basically everybody that's come through this system. This coaching staff just does such a phenomenal job of making sure that all of their players feel comfortable, but I think Mickey has really been the superstar, and if he can continue to play like he did in the LEC, this team, you know, is going to be a real tough out against anybody in the world, even the best teams. And then Hans has been a really consistent carry. He's actually been a lot more aggressive and a lot more active in the early game than I was expecting. He's always been a really good laner, and he's been a solid team fighter in the past as well, but I think both of those have taken a step up over the course of this year. He's basically back into that rogue Hansama version that we kind of got in 2021, when it really felt like he completely broke out. Not that he wasn't great before that, obviously. His time on Misfits was great, and his, you know, first year on Rogue was also really good when that team was kind of an underdog, but I do think that him and Mickey are playing some of the best League they've ever played in their entire career. Very great in the early 2v2, that's where they generate a lot of their advantages, but consistent in the mid to late game as well. They don't really have any outstanding weaknesses. Just a really good bot lane duo, and then you've got the top side of the map, which obviously is incredibly impressive. We have to talk about Caps, because he's probably the most talented player that the West has ever had. I'm going to continue to stay on that kind of train, but he's been a little bit more inconsistent over the past few years than maybe you would like. He really has gotten his form back, I would say, in recent weeks. He's looked like the Caps that we all know and love in the last, like, month or so. The season finals was a really good tournament for him. He looked really good there, and that's good to see. Obviously, we all kind of expected him to be able to figure it out because it's Caps, and that's just kind of what he does. He always figures it out because he's too good not to figure it out. But I will say, it was looking a little bit concerning. And not because his mechanics were bad or anything like that, but rather, he was just taking too many risks. He was limit testing a little bit too much in the LEC over the course of this year. I don't expect that to be a problem here at Worlds, because I don't think he'll be limit testing all that much, but it's certainly not the most consistent year of all time from Caps. And then you've got Broken Blade and Yike on the top side. Broken Blade obviously staying from last year. What a career turnaround he's had. He was a player that I think a lot of people considered to be a very resource-heavy, very strong side player that wasn't necessarily going to be good on teams that maybe have superstars surrounding him, but he's basically been the opposite here. He has completely adapted his playstyle and basically been everything that G2 has needed. He can still carry games, and he does a lot. He's a great laner, probably a better laner than he's ever been this year, and I do think he's been better on weak side as well. If you leave him isolated in the 1v1, he's probably going to get a chance to win that. He still does sometimes run into trouble being a little bit over-aggressive and getting caught out by enemy junglers in bad positions, but that's happened a lot less this year than I think it has at other points in his career, which is a positive. And then for Yike, their superstar rookie jungler that's come in and basically been the best jungler in the LEC this year in terms of production, kind of came in as this big carry threat. Caps was playing a lot of these more initiation, you know, engaged type of mid laners, things like the Zac and the Sejuani, so that Yike could play some of his more aggressive picks like the Bel'Veth that he's kind of gotten known for. However, that's kind of flipped around. I think the narrative that Yike can only play carries definitely got to G2, and I think they've worked really hard to get rid of that narrative over the course of the back half of the year. Yike has been phenomenal on Maokai and Rel and Sejuani and a lot of these champions that they weren't playing nearly as much at the beginning of the year, and so I think Yike's a really good, well-rounded player that is very positive for this team. They basically have found the next great European jungler. Everybody already kind of knew about Yike. He was definitely a top prospect, but for him to go to G2, I think especially that has really sped up his growth and really shown just how good of a player he can and will probably be. And so, as you can see, I like this G2 team a lot. But, like I said, you know, going through these players, it's not like they're the most consistent players of all time. Hans and Mickey are having bounce-back years, and that's great. But Hans isn't exactly the most game takeover AD carry, right? He's just very good within the structure of this team. This team does a great job of getting him ahead. I just don't know, you know, that's going to be enough to really, like, make a difference in an ADC-focused meta. Mickey is a difference maker, and Caps is sure to be a difference maker at Worlds, but is Broken Blade going to be able to survive and dominate like he has been in the LEC against the best top laners? Is Yike in his second ever international tournament after MSI, his first ever Worlds, his first ever year in top pro play, is he going to be able to step up and be as good as he was in the LEC? These are just question marks that I don't have nearly as many with on the top 8 teams. And so, as much as I do like G2, and as much as I really could see them getting out of the Swiss stage, for me, they come in at number 9 and at the bottom of the B tier. But now we've done it. We've gotten into my top 8 teams here at the World Championships, and if you're a keen, eagle-eyed viewer, or if you've just thought about this for 2 seconds, then you'll notice that all 4 of the LCK and the LPL teams are still alive. They are the top 8. You're 4 teams from the LCK, you're 4 teams from the LPL. It just is how it is. I truly do believe that they are the 8 best teams at this tournament at the current moment, and I really do think there's a pretty big difference in between the LCK and the LPL, and then the LEC and the LCS, even if I do like G2, and I do still think they're in B tier, which means I could realistically see them getting out of the Swiss stage. These are my predicted 8 at the current moment. So kicking off with number 8 here, and I guess the bottom of this, kind of in the middle of the B tier though, I have Weibo Gaming, the number 4 seed from the LPL. I do have coming in at number 8. I was actually really close to putting G2 at number 8 and putting Weibo at number 9. I think this is probably the closest like break point that you can get with a team potentially not from the LPL or LCK making the top 8. I think Weibo is definitely a team with some question marks, and one that I don't even fully believe in myself. I certainly don't think that they've proven everything over the course of this year, but I do think they've proven enough to, at the very least, be considered here in the top 8. There are a couple of elite-level players on this team that I just think, you know, other teams don't have, and I think that, for me, pushes it just slightly over the edge. Would love to know your guys' thoughts on that, because I'm sure it's not going to be popular down in the comments below. But let's go ahead and go over their roster. Their lineup is looking like the Shy in the top lane, Weiwei in the jungle, Xiaohu in the mid lane, Light at AD carry, and Crisp at support. Very similarly to what we've been doing for a lot of these teams. Let's first talk about the best parts of the team, and that's going to start in the bot lane for Weibo. Light and Crisp, who I think really have been kind of the carries for this team over the course of this year, or at least the stable carries, because there have been other players that I think have had great games, and we'll talk about Xiaohu in a bit, because I still really like Xiaohu, and honestly, he's a player that I've continued to state is underrated over the course of basically this entire channel's history, and I continue to believe that he's underrated. But Light and Crisp have been their game in and game out for this team. Both of them have kind of gained the reputation of being hyper-consistent, and I think that's fair. I think Light was ironically less consistent this year than he was last year on LNG, when he was just everything that that team needed, and almost got them to Worlds basically off the back of himself alone. But pairing him up with a better team around him this year, you know, a better support in Crisp, quite frankly, and he's able to do a whole ton. He's really able to be a great carry. I do think he felt a lot more confident, and so some of the, you know, ups and downs were definitely a little bit more obvious. I think he had a couple of worse games than he had last year, but his good games were still just as good, and Light is a really, really solid player. An AD carry you can win Worlds with. Like, genuinely, he is good enough for that. He is a big positive for this team. And then Crisp, for me, is one of the top 5 best supports in the entire world at the current moment. He has been playing like that all year long. He was great for Weibo, and honestly, in my opinion, he's this team's best player. I know I've said that about a lot of supports at this tournament, but that's because I think support is such a crucial role in how the game currently goes. To me, it's jungle, it's ADC, and it's support. Those are your 3 roles that simply have to be good at this tournament in order for you to do incredibly well. And I think luckily for Weibo, they at the very least have 2, and probably 2.5-ish out of those roles being elite-level players, and Crisp is definitely falling into that category. I love him on every type of champion that he likes to play, whether it's Rel, whether it's Nami, whether it's Leona. Talked about it a bit before, but this team is certainly not afraid to go to Lucian Nami, more so than a lot of other teams, even after the nerfs, which is certainly something to be considerable of. But I really like Light and Crisp, and if there's a reason to be optimistic about this team, I think Light and Crisp are a better bot lane than Hansama and Mickey X, and that's why Weibo comes in above them on the list for me. But I still like the rest of these players quite a bit as well. Xiaohu is still really, really good. I've made this argument over the course of, you know, this year and last year as well, but nothing's really changed about him as a player, so it can apply. His laning can sometimes be a little bit inconsistent, but there's an argument to be made that he is the best team fighter in the world, like, regardless of position. He is so fantastic in the back half of games. He's so consistent at being able to make the right thing happen, and I know team fighting isn't quite as sexy as, like, laning stats. Like, you're not going to be as heralded if you're up 40 CS versus, like, doing a really nice Syndra stun in a team fight, right? It's just a little bit of a different, I guess, role in the team, but Xiaohu is really, really, really good at team fighting, and he's world class at that. So, even if his laning has gotten a little bit worse, I would say, over the last year, I think he's just as valuable as a player because there really just aren't a lot of mid laners that are going to be able to keep up. It's like having another carry on your team no matter how many resources he has. It's incredibly impressive. His positioning is great, and he's still a smart player. He likes moving around the map. He's going to play with the rest of this team. He is a little bit more beholden to lane, I would say, than some of the other mid laners in the early game, but in not a negative way. He is going to get to the part of the game where he's relevant, and games are rarely over against Weibo, mostly because of Xiaohu. And then you've got the top side of the map, the Shy and Weiwei, kind of two very opposite conversations to have between these two players. Weiwei obviously coming in midway through the year as kind of a replacement to Karsa, who just wasn't working out with this team. I think Karsa got a bad rap. I don't think he was even half as bad as Reddit will make you believe. I've talked about that a ton. Reddit has decided that he's like a bottom 5 jungler in the LPL, and the tape just doesn't back that up. It's absurd to even be saying that, but you know, I think anybody who watched the games will actually have that opinion, right? It's just kind of the narrative has gotten completely out of control, and Reddit likes to villainize players that they deem targets, but Weiwei's been an upgrade to this team. Saying all that about Karsa, Weiwei has been an upgrade to this team, if only just because he's more consistent. I've said this for a while. I think his good games are worse than Karsa's good games. Even over the course of this year, when Karsa was on, like, it was an auto win for Weibo in the spring split, and there was a lot that was just, like, instantly done from Karsa, but Karsa would also have bad games, and I think Weiwei just doesn't have those bad games, and that's kind of the positive. Now, saying that, he has had a couple of games recently that have been very underwhelming, and I'm really not sold on Weiwei as an elite level jungler at the Worlds level, and so, you know, I think that's definitely something that could hold them back. And then, of course, you've got the Shy on the top side. I had played around with him being even lower in terms of the rankings on this list than number 10, because I'm not even sure he's not a bottom 5 top laner in the LPL. I certainly think he's somewhere around, like, number 10, probably somewhere in the middle of the pack, but he's not been good this year. There really is no other way to put it. He's had so many games that he's, like, solo lost for Weibo just in laning phase by continuously giving gold over to this giant big bruiser, Cassante, or Jax, or Renekton, or something, and then all of a sudden the game is just over. However, he's transitioned more into a weak side role. He's been playing a lot more Ornn in the summer split, and I think that's what he's gonna need to do at the Worlds level. I just don't think the Shy is the Shy that we remember anymore in terms of being able to carry games. There were glimpses, there were flashes of that in his gameplay in 2023, but to pretend like it was even, you know, more than 5% of his games is just probably not true. I think if Weibo is going to succeed, if they are going to make this number 8 spot, it's probably going to be because bot side is strong side, and you're going to be able to play through them early. Weiwei is going to be active on the map, not making mistakes. The Shy is going to survive, and Xiaohu is going to be incredibly consistent towards the back half. Weibo can be very aggressive, but they can also be very feast or famine in a grand scale. They've beaten JD Gaming twice over the course of this year, which nobody else in the world has been able to say. And they've also lost to some of the worst teams in the LPL regularly and consistently. And so this is a team that I think can beat anybody on any given day, but they can also lose to anybody. And so they're going to be fun to watch, but certainly not a team that I'm, you know, trying to nail down expectations for, because their range of outcomes is just simply too wide. And now moving on to number 7. This is going to be the top of the B tier for me. Like I said, B tier are teams that you could very realistically see get out of Swiss stage, that I truly do believe are good enough to get out of Swiss stage if everything goes perfect for them and if something goes wrong for somebody else, but not teams that I'm expecting to make it super far. Probably quarterfinals teams or before, right? Probably not semifinals teams in my opinion. And coming in at number 7 for me in that list is going to be Dplus KIA. I have them coming in at number 7. I think this is a relatively fair place to put them. I had to try to balance my thoughts on what I saw on tape from DK versus the expectation of these players and what we kind of know from past experiences with how they all basically level up once they get to this tournament. So it was certainly a little bit of an intriguing factor to try and calculate that in. I think they land at number 7 basically either way, and so I definitely feel more comfortable putting them there. I could see them getting higher than this. I genuinely believe this is probably their floor at the tournament. I don't really expect to see this team not get out of Swiss stage. I would expect Weibo to be much more of a potential casualty in that top 8 for G2 than I would say DK would be, because I think they're going to be very consistent against bad teams, but the upside of this team hasn't necessarily been as much as you would have expected from a team with these kinds of players over the course of this year. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Kana in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, Deft at AD carry, and Kellen at supporter. I believe it's going to be Kellen the whole tournament. I'm sure they're bringing Bible. They swapped out supports a ton over the course of this year, but Kellen played the entirety of the playoffs, and he also played the entirety of the regional qualifier that got DK to this tournament in the first place. And so I would expect Kellen to continue to be their starting support in this instance. But let's go ahead and talk about this team. Of course, starting off with Canyon and Showmaker, because they're Canyon and Showmaker. We simply have to start off with them. Showmaker and Deft were the 2 players that got honorable mentions on my top 20 list. Showmaker actually making the list, coming in at number 20 on that list. And so, you know, I definitely feel pretty good about Showmaker. I think, like I said in that list, kind of reiterating some points, he had a very underratedly great year. He certainly wasn't consistent. That's not the word that you can use to describe the year that Showmaker had. He had a couple of really bad weeks back-to-back, and there were just a couple of stretches over the course of this season where he was very underwhelming as a mid laner. But if you're taking the end of Spring Split and the beginning of Summer Split, like a 5-week stretch between those two in the regular season, he was playing like the best player in the world during a couple of weeks during this split. He really was playing out of his mind, and I think it more, you know, reflects kind of where Showmaker is probably going to be at by the time we hit the World Championships. He was awesome in the regional qualifier. He was fantastic. He was able to carry this team across the finish line, and he really looked great. I expect Showmaker to continue to look great at this tournament, and I expect him to be one of the more quote-unquote surprisingly great players, right? People always write off Canyon and Showmaker going into international tournaments because their regular seasons are always a little bit disappointing towards their reputations, but that's just what they do. They've done this every single year. Literally the exact same thing happened last year before they almost took down Gen.G in the quarterfinals. So Canyon's the other one you got to talk about. I think Canyon had a lot more question marks in the regular season than someone like Showmaker did. I think Canyon's playstyle just isn't quite as effective as it was like 3 years ago. That being said, Canyon is still an elite level jungle talent. As you can see, I have him coming in at number 3 on my jungle ranking. You'll notice he wasn't in my top 20 video. That's because there were only 2 junglers in my top 20 video. I think number 3 to like number 6 in the jungle ranking is completely interchangeable. So if you want Canyon at 3, if you want Canyon at 6, I feel like that's kind of the range where they literally all had basically identical grades from me going into this tournament. I just trust Canyon to be able to level up a little bit more than I trust those others to be able to level up. Canyon was phenomenal at Worlds last year. He was one of the best players at the entire tournament, even if the team around him didn't necessarily live up to that expectation. And, you know, I think he had a really bad year last year. People don't remember that. That's, I think, the one argument that people seem to forget is that in 2022, people were going into the World Championships calling me crazy for having him at number 4 in the jungle rankings. People were like, you're insane, that's way too high, he's been inting all year, you put him in All-Pro, you're so biased, you just go based off the names. And then he was like the best player at the tournament, and all of a sudden you turn around, and people are like, oh, he was easily top 1, I can't believe insert K-Droll or Dom or whoever made tier list didn't have him at number 1, they're so stupid. I mean, League fans are fickle, but this is a great example of that, right? Canyon's probably going to have another really good tournament, and all the people that were just saying how awful Canyon was for the last 4 months are probably going to turn it around, and that's just how this goes. I expect him to be fine. However, again, he's certainly not been consistent. He's been making a lot more uncharacteristic errors, a lot of mistakes, especially in the early game, that he does need to clean up, but he can clean those up. We've seen him play cleaner in the past. I expect it to happen again. You've got the rest of this team. Deft and Kellen in the bot lane, I actually really like. I think they're crazy underrated. Deft, I think, is, you know, had a really good year. I think his 2023 has been better overall than his 2022, where he won the World Championship as an individual performer. I think that he's been given more responsibility on this DK team, and I think that he has absolutely made it worthwhile. He's been a really good early game presence, and he's been hyper consistent. He's never been an issue for DK, and I think that that's been a positive. Kellen, I think, is definitely the right choice to start in the support position. I've been saying that all year. Bible came in and looked okay, but Kellen's a player that I think is crazy underrated. I wanted to put him higher than number 7 in terms of my support rankings. I just couldn't quite justify it, but I like Kellen quite a bit. I still consider him a borderline world, elite level support in the grand scheme of things. He's a top 10 support in the world, and I think that that's pretty clear when he came back into the team and the team started to figure things out. And then Kana in the top lane has had a perfect arc for Worlds. He was a little bit, up and down, I would say, at the beginning of the year. He had some good moments in spring, but wasn't super consistent. And then as the year has gone on, it felt like he started to get on a better page with Canyon and started to work a lot better with this team. And his laning stats have improved, and he's been playing the best league that he's been playing all year going into this tournament. This is the same kind of arc that you would hope to see from a top laner that doesn't necessarily need to be the focal point of a lot of your attacking, phase of the game. And so I like Kana. I think he's going to be a positive for this team. I think he's been a lot better than people give him credit for. He was all pro caliber in the LCK this split. And so I like DK. I think there's a lot of hate going towards this team right now, and I think a lot of people are going to regret that when the tournament ends up starting, and then obviously a lot of these players end up stepping up. Now, is there a reality where they don't do that and they play much more similarly to what they did towards the end of the regular season? I definitely think it's possible, but they looked great in the regional qualifier. They took down a very good Hanwha Life team that I know a lot of people are out on, but that's just how LCK fans go. I think DK is a dark horse, a surprise team that could potentially, jump up into that A tier if things end up going right. For now, they're going to sit at the top of the B tier and come in at number 7, but this is a team that I would expect to be very, very competitive and certainly not an easy out even for the best teams in the world. And now we go into number 6 in these power rankings, and this is going to be the start of my A tier. These are going to be the teams that are a step up, in my opinion, from the B tier. B tier are teams that, realistically have a good shot of being able to make it out of the Swiss stage, but I could also see them underperforming. I think one of those 3 will likely not make it out. Well, obviously, one of those 3 at the very least will not make it out, but it's probably going to be one of those 3. I think everybody from here on out should get out of the Swiss stage. These really are the ones I would be surprised if they underperformed, and I do think that these A-tier, teams have a potential to win Worlds if everything goes right. They're not the favorites, but they're certainly, teams that I have my eye on. So kicking that off with number 6, for me, it is going to be KT Rolster. I have them coming in at number 6 here in the A tier. I think that's pretty respectable. I've seen a lot of people both high and low on this team. A lot of KT fans out there, especially with some of the recent success, with how fun this team has been to watch over the course of this year. You've seen a lot of KT fans kind of emerge and be really passionate about the team. We've always had a ton of KT fans in these comment sections, and I'm very appreciative of it. I like this KT team, and I think this is the best KT has been since 2018, since Worlds was last in Korea. I think this is the best version of the team since then, and I think there's a lot of reason to like this team. I've also seen a lot of analysts, especially popular ones, really dislike this team. I'm not going to name names, but K-Troll dislikes this team a considerable amount, and I think it's certainly influenced a lot of people who may not watch the LCK, so I'll try to fight back on that narrative a little bit here. Let's go ahead and talk about them. Their lineup is looking like Keen in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, aiming at AD carry, and Lehens at support. A lot of these players I already talked about, and basically from this point on in the list, I've already talked about a lot of these players in my top 20 list, so I might not go as in-depth on their individual strengths and weaknesses as players. I will on the players that weren't in that list, but again, go check out that video if you really want a breakdown of why I think some of these players are some of the most elite in the world at the current moment. But let's go ahead and talk about the players that were on that list. Coming in highest on that list for me was Lehens. The support here for KT Rolster, he came in at number 9 within that top 10, and I really truly do believe that he is currently the best support in the world. I know it's a very controversial topic to end up talking about because there were a lot of good supports. Missing is fantastic. On is fantastic. I like Crisp a lot as well. People really like Delight. There are a lot of options, I think, to include in a conversation like that. Keria in a conversation like that. But Lehens, to me, has clearly separated himself as the one who I think creates the most for his team over the course of this year. He is your reigning LCK MVP. I think people tend to forget about that. He just had probably the split of his career in the summer split, really separating himself, being the best player on the best team in the regular season. Now, things didn't exactly go as well in the playoffs, but I don't blame Lehens. Lehens was still really good in those series, and I feel pretty confident about him Then you've got the two solo laners, Keen and BDD. Keen came in at number 10 in my top 20 list. I think Keen is fantastic. One of the best and certainly one of the most consistent top laners in the world at the current moment. I think he just does everything well. I've talked about it. His laning is very good, especially when he gets to isolate 1v1. He's probably the best team fighter in the world in terms of top laners. I think it's very close, but in grouped 5v5 team fights where he can play an initiator or a tank or a backline flanker, I think he does a better job than basically anybody else at being able to make those, opportunities count, and I just think he's very consistent. I love Keen. He's had a great year, a great bounce back. He's been fantastic. Anybody who's watched the LCK knows that. BDD has also been fantastic for this team. He came in pretty highly on that list as well, inside the top 15 in my top 20. He's been an MVP caliber player in the LCK all year long. Now, his summer split, in my opinion, wasn't nearly as dominant as his spring split was, but I think that was because he was giving up more resources to the rest of the team, aiming in particular, which I do think is a positive overall. BDD is certainly not a selfish player, but very versatile one, somebody who's going to want to move around the map, and especially towards the back half of games, likes to be a main initiator, a main engager for the team, which is very rare to see out of the mid lane position. I like those three, but the two I didn't have on that list, Cuz and Aiming, are definitely going to be more of the question marks for this team as you head into this tournament, but not major ones. I trust Cuz quite a bit. What a great year from Cuz. This was somebody who I doubted a lot over the course of his career. I certainly said a lot of things last year about Cuz, and I was really kind of convinced that he was a, I don't want to say weak link for a KT team that, kind of disappointed it didn't make Worlds, but I wasn't a huge fan of Cuz. I think I've completely changed my tune. I think he's been great over the course of this year, very consistent, basically everything you want. He plays a lot of different styles and, really makes them all work. He definitely can carry games towards the back half. He's one of the junglers that's been the most confident in playing some of these more late game carries like the Viego, but he's certainly a good engager and facilitator as well if you need that. I just think pairing up with someone like BDD, who does like the Nico, who does like the Annie, I think playing more Viego actually makes a lot of sense. Playing something potentially like a Nocturne makes a lot of sense. Bel'Veth kind of coming back into the meta. There are options, I think, in those roles for Cuz to be able to fill, and I do think he's going to be looking towards that, maybe more so than a lot of other junglers at this tournament. I like Cuz. I certainly don't think he's a bad player. And then you've got Aiming, another player who I've grown to like. I was very low on Aiming. Not last year. I feel like I was personally right where I should have been on Aiming last year, where he showed a lot of good things. He was having a lot of good games, but he was also given so many resources by his team that it was really hard to separate performance from kind of results, if you will. But Aiming before that in his career had basically disappointed everywhere he had been in, so I was very hesitant to say that he was a top-level AD carry. He performed fantastic this year, especially in the summer split when he started getting more resources. He was really weak side all of spring split and was just kind of an okay player for a team that, was really good around him, BDD and Keen in particular, and then in summer, I think they really wanted to play more towards bot lane because of the way the meta was moving, and I think Aiming really stepped up and did everything he needed to do. I don't think he's a super-duper star, right? He's not top 5 in his position in the world, but I do believe he's a player you can win Worlds with. He's good enough at the AD carry role to be able to capitalize on what a lot of these other great playmakers are able to create, Lehens and BDD in particular, and I think this KT Rolster team is very, very, very well constructed to be able to do well in this tournament. Now, there are inconsistencies. A lot of these players were really good this year and then really bad in the playoffs, and that's certainly something to keep an eye out for. I wasn't a huge fan of how this bot lane played in the playoffs, and Cuz, I think, definitely had a worse playoff run. Keen also was worse in the playoffs, I would say. BDD probably the one player that I think survived at the very least a little bit in their playoff run, but I think KT is still a really good team. I think the fact that they lost to T1 twice is not an indicator that they suck, just rather that T1 I think is very good, which we will talk about later, but I trust KT quite a bit. I certainly think they deserve to be in the A tier, even if I maybe have a few more question marks about them than I do for teams in the top 5. All right, and that's going to bring us into our top 5 teams here at the tournament, here at Worlds 2023. Very excited to get into these teams. These are, in my opinion, the 5 best teams in the world. I think it's pretty clear that, all of the teams up until this point are the best in the world, but really, these are the top 5 teams in the world. And it might be a little bit of a surprising order. Coming in at number 5 in the middle of A tier for me, it is going to be Bilibili Gaming. Maybe shockingly, the number 2 seed from the LPL lands here at number 5 in my power rankings. There is reason to believe that while a lot of people are really high on Bilibili leading up until this point, that their recent performances are kind of an indicator of maybe where they're at the current moment, or more specifically, where a lot of the other teams in this tournament are at the current moment. So Big fan of what, you know, Bilibili has done up until this point this year, but I'm not sure I can trust them to be a top 3 team at this tournament with the way that they are currently performing. So let's go ahead and go over why I might be a little bit lower on this team. Their lineup is looking like Bin in the top lane, Jun in the jungle, Yagao in the mid lane, Elk at AD carry, and On at support. There are still a lot of reasons to like this team. You would not come in the top 5 of my Worlds rankings if I didn't truly still believe that you were a team that could realistically win the World Championships. I just don't know if I necessarily believe in them as much as I did about 3 or 4 months ago when they came out of MSI as MSI finalists. I think that they are a weaker team now than they were then, and I do think that a lot of the other teams in the world have gotten better since then, and so for me, there are just some question marks. I think there are a lot of positives on this team. 3 of these players, again, still made my top 20. Bin in the top lane came in as my #1 top laner at number 6 in my top 20 players at the tournament ranking, and I think that's a very fair assessment of him. He is a top, 6 to 5 player in the world right now. There is no top laner in the world that carries like Bin does. He's the best mid-game top laner I've ever seen. Really, the only player that I can remember even remotely kind of being on that level was Khan, years and years ago. Not even, end of career Khan, who still was great, but, peak Khan, 2018, 2019 Khan, is what I remember from, mid-game dominance, but Bin is right there with him in terms of what he's been able to do. Over the course of 2023, he's the best Gwen I've ever seen, and he can play everything. He can be weak side if you need him to be. That's been the big development for him over the course of this year, but he's still definitely more of a strong side top laner, and probably the best in the world at that. And then also, both members of this bot lane ended up making my top 20 list. Both Elk and On coming in a little bit higher, coming in at number 11, just outside of my top 10. Elk a little bit lower, coming in at number 16, but still both making my top 20. Definitely a lot of positives to talk about from these two. Both of them were kind of written off for being on poor teams, or not necessarily being as consistent as you may like out of these positions, but both of them had shown ridiculous amounts of talent over the past few years, and I think a lot of people, maybe it was just me, I don't know, were expecting a big breakout this year from them. I had always been on the hype train for Elk and On. They're 2 of the best takes that I've ever had on this channel, and they continue to look good. I still like them a lot. On's one of the most aggressive supports in the world. He is going to give up, potential resources in order to try to make plays, but for the most part, that works. He can cause his team problems sometimes. Think of a juiced up Hylissang is the comparison that I always use for him, but I do think he's incredibly mechanically talented, arguably the most mechanically talented support in the world. His Blitzcrank is an actual problem, and something that you will see teams ban against Bilibili, and that's pretty crazy to say, first rotation. And then Elk, he's very consistent, very aggressive as an AD carry. People don't necessarily give him the credit for how much he playmakes himself, because he does play with a lot of other playmakers, but he's very good at being able to create action, and he's good at following up on it. At his absolute best, he's a top 3-ish AD carry in the world. He comes in just outside of that at number 4, but I do think it's very close. I talked about that in the top 20 list. If you want to put him as a top 3 ADC in the world right now, I'm really not going to be all that mad at you. I think he's very close, and he's very talented. That bot lane's a positive. The top side is a positive. Now, jungle mid, for most of this year, has been a positive. Again, they struggled a lot in spring, and that was very well documented on this channel, where I was talking about how Jun and Yagao both looked really poor for most of the regular season in the spring split, because it just didn't feel like they were ever on the same page, but something clicked for them in the playoffs in spring, where they were able to make finals, and then they were dominant at MSI, and they were dominant again in the summer regular season, and I'm like, okay, these two have figured it out. They know exactly how to play off of each other, and they're now going to be the best jungle mid duo, potentially, in the world. They really were that good for a little bit, but man, did the wheels fall off in the playoffs. They basically completely reverted to the form that they had in the spring regular season. Almost the exact same style of mistakes as well, which is very concerning. Now, hopefully it's just a small sample size, but obviously getting trounced by J.D.G is okay. It happens every once in a while. Getting destroyed by LNG was certainly concerning, and they looked bad in that series. Again, it's just one series. I don't want to try to overreact, but Jun and Yagao really struggled to keep up with the pressure that was generated from LNG in the early game, and that's something BLG has been great on all year, is establishing pressure early. They've never really had to play from behind, specifically in the regular season, and so to see them struggle so much when they were presented with that basically for the first time outside of a JD Gaming series, it was concerning, and it certainly did leave some question marks. Jun is definitely more of an aggressive jungler, somebody who does like to carry and will play up and far forward, but, he's more of an engager now. The Wukong definitely comes to mind as something that can do a little bit of both, but he's played a ton of Maokai and Sedge over the course of this year as well, and Yagao, obviously we know Yagao. He is a facilitating mid laner, maybe one of the best of all time, but he's really grown as a carry player as well. I think both of them can be kind of interchangeable in that regard, but I just don't know if I trust them as much as I trust some of the other jungle mid duos that are going to be ranked above them, and I do think that when you look at the grand scheme of this team, while talent-wise, on paper, how they've performed kind of indicates that they should be probably a top 3 team in the world. I just don't know. I'm scared off by that series against LNG, if I'm being entirely honest. And I really do believe that the teams at the top right now are just clicking on a level that I don't know BLG is clicking on. Now, could they get back into that zone? Almost certainly. It really wouldn't even take all that much effort to get back into that zone, but I'm going to need to see them get back into it before I just crown them. I really do believe this is still a team that could win Worlds if everything goes right, but they definitely have to show something that is not their most recent tape. And then moving on to number 4 in these rankings, still in the A tier. We're not quite at the top just yet. There is a tier above A, which I think is appropriate considering the teams at this tournament. But coming in at number 4 for me, maybe a little higher than you'll see them on other placements, I have LNG Esports. They are going to be my number 2 team coming out of the LPL. They are the 3rd seed coming out of the LPL because of championship points. However, they were in the finals of the LPL summer split. They lost to JD Gaming, but they were able to take a game and they destroyed Bilibili in their semifinals matchup, which it gave me enough confidence to feel pretty good about putting LNG at this number 4 spot. I really like how this team has come together over the back half of the year. You can talk about how, one series shouldn't be enough to completely change your perception on a team, and I would agree with that. That's a statement that I entirely agree with, and my counter argument would be that I'm not changing this based on just the BLG series. LNG taking down BLG was the culmination of the improvements that LNG had been making all year long. Up until that point, they had gotten better and better and better. Up until, obviously, they had gotten to that semifinals, and they really showed that they had come together and kind of achieved the dream that this roster had when coming together, or when Gala joined in the summer split. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Zika in the top lane, Tarzan in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, Gala at AD carry, and Hong at support. This lineup on paper is completely stacked, and we've known that basically all year long. As soon as Gala joined, we were like, oh my god, Tarzan, Scout, Gala as a big 3 with like Hong and even Zika, who had really improved as kind of the ancillary pieces on this team. That's crazy strong, and if they can figure it out, if they can adapt well to each other's games coming together midway through the season, then I really do believe that that could be this World Championship winning team. And you know what? It didn't really look like that at first. They were losing games left and right. They got destroyed by Bilibili in the regular season. They ended up losing to Weibo as well. And we were like, oh, all right, they're just not elite, right? They're a good team, but they're not an elite team. They're not going to be able to figure it out. It's too short of a split, but things got better and better and better and better, and Gala got better, and Scout really continued to be the guy that he was in spring. And Tarzan kind of shook off some rust. He was really not all that consistent over the beginning part, especially of the summer split, but he started to figure things out, and all of a sudden this big 3 started playing like a big 3 going into the playoffs. They were really hot, and they continued that in the playoffs. They continued to dominate some of those series. They took down a lot of really good teams, including being the ones to knock Top Esports out of Worlds this year, which is a big accomplishment considering I don't think TES was a disaster of a team, if you will, and I think LNG was fantastic. I think them going on winning that series looked really good. They obviously beat Weibo to get into the semifinals, and then, of course, they beat Bilibili to get into the finals. They end up losing to JD Gaming, who is, it's certainly no shame in losing to Gen.G, who's clearly been the best team in the world up until this point, but they then have to go into the regional qualifier because they finished, pretty bad, or at least in comparison to what they did in the regular season, in the spring split. And so they didn't have enough championship points to auto-qualify, but they absolutely obliterated EDG, Edward Gaming, to get to that spot. And, EDG was certainly not a bad team either. Obviously, things didn't end up working out for them, but LNG has proven that I think they are a top 4 team in the world at the current moment. I think they're peaking at the right time. I think a lot of these players are ridiculously talented, and a lot of them are having career years. And speaking of career years, we have to start with Scout, who has been, and I said this in my top 20 list, the most productive player in the world in 2023. And I don't think anybody saw that coming. Him leaving EDG, going to LNG, kind of replacing Doenb in a system that didn't really work last year. Kind of a similar type of player, or at least, a similar caliber of player in terms of how good they are. I wasn't super sold, especially because I didn't trust the pieces around them all that much, especially in the spring split, but Scout was phenomenal, easily the MVP of the spring split. He was my MVP, he was the broadcast's MVP, he was fantastic, just couldn't quite get it done in the playoffs because the team around him, like I said, just wasn't complete enough. But to try and rectify that problem, they end up bringing in Gala from RNG midway through the year. He becomes their starting AD carry, and that really fixes a lot of the issues that this team had. The real problem that they had in spring, in my opinion, was that enemy teams would just focus Tarzan and Scout, specifically in the playoffs. They would spend so many resources to shut them down. And yeah, Tarzan and Scout were problems in those games, but that's because it was essentially a 5v2, with bot lane being given infinite resources and doing basically nothing with them. And so having a player like Gala that you just simply can't ignore on the map is it's a problem for enemy teams. And while Gala started slow, he ended the regular season being one of the best AD carries in the LPL, and he continued that in the playoffs. He was spectacular, and Scout obviously stepped up as well. He was the broadcast MVP in summer as well. Wasn't quite mine, but he did finish second in my voting, and so I'm certainly not trying to take anything away from him. He was the best mid laner in the LPL and probably the most productive mid laner in the world this year, and that's ridiculous considering how stacked that position is. If he can continue playing like that at Worlds, if he can continue playing in this system as well as he has over the course of this year, I mean, they have a real shot of winning Worlds. He's best player in the world caliber with how he's playing right now, and you could say the same thing about Gala. Now, I don't agree that Gala is like a top 10 player in the world. I had him at number 15 in my top 20 rankings. And I've always talked about it. I think Gala is a pretty fairly rated player. I don't think anybody considers him a top 2, top 3 ADC in the world. Maybe top 3, but not a top 5 or a top 10-ish player in the world. He's a top 15 player in the world, and everybody knows it. He's fantastic. He's really good. He's really consistent. Great team fighter. Really good in early laning phase. He's just not going to have that killer instinct to completely take over games. And that's fine. He's just someone who really likes playing in structure just a tad bit more than maybe the best AD carries in the world. And you can get away with that, especially because Scout creates so much. And Hong is a very good engaged support. Again, he's not the most aggressive player, but he does prefer the engagers. He's somebody who is really good at creating plays when they are available to him, and I do think that he does that very well to set players like Gala up. You also have Tarzan. Everybody's going to rank Tarzan incredibly highly. I've seen him in the top 10 of some people's top 20s, which to me is ridiculous considering how his year has gone, but he's still a good player. I'm not going to try and shit on Tarzan. I still really like him, and I do think he's a positive for LNG, but let's not pretend like a lot of this year wasn't spent talking about how Tarzan was underperforming on this super team. He obviously figured things out, and he was great in their playoff run, like he has been for the most part in basically every playoffs that he has been in, but there are question marks on whether or not he is going to be able to do that game in and game out because of the inconsistencies that we saw. But I still think there is a real argument to be made that he's the best facilitating jungler in the world. I mean, it's him versus Peanut, right? Like, whoever you want to go with on that front. Because he's really not a big carry player. He likes playing engaged tanks. He likes playing those more initiator style of champions. And I do think that works for the rest of this team. And then for Zika on the top side, I think he's fine. He's certainly not going to be a problem. He was really good at points in spring when he was getting more resources, but because the team has started moving more towards the bot lane, wanting to play for Gala a bit more, he's been the de facto weak side, and he's done really well in that role. That's the role he's probably going to adopt almost every game here at the World Championships, but he's really good at it, and so I'm not concerned. I like this team's construction, I like their makeup, and I like how they've been playing recently. They've gotten better all year long. They've proven that they know how to beat some of the better teams in the world. Now, if they can continue to level up as we go into the World Championships, there really is nothing that can stop them from being world champions. On paper, this is arguably the second strongest team in the world, and that really is the case. If Tarzan, Scout, and Gala can play at their best, if Zika takes that massive step up, if Hong can really prove that he deserves to be here on a super team, then LNG is going to be one of those teams that I think a lot of people regret not ranking higher pre-tournament. But now we finally get a chance to move into the top 3. The top 3 teams at the tournament. These are all teams that I truly do believe can win it all. I think A tier is going to end here, though. This will be the final team at the top of the A tier. The final 2 teams will kind of be classed within their own tier, if you will. And finishing off our A tier and coming in at number 3 for me, it is going to be T1. They are going to come in pretty highly on my list at number 3. I think some people are going to put them lower. I think some people might put them higher. I mean, I think there really is an argument to be made that there are conversations surrounding how good this T1 team can actually be, but for now, I think this is probably the most fair way to evaluate this team. They've done a ton right, and basically ever since they got to play with their full lineup, they've been unbeatable. They've been basically only beatable by the other best team in Korea that we will talk about in just a second. But I think T1 more than deserves to be listed right outside of the top 2, the consensus top 2 from a lot of people. So let's go ahead and talk about why their lineup is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. Of course, we've talked about almost every single one of these players already in my top 20 video. At least the bottom 3, the top 2 I didn't quite bring up, which might surprise some people, but let's go ahead and talk about Faker first and foremost, because this still is Faker's team. No matter what you want to say, no matter how much you want to talk about him not necessarily being the player he was a decade ago, this is still his team, and we're still living in his world. He is still one of the best players in the world. And honestly, I would argue that he's playing better right now than he has in the last couple of years. This was kind of a re-emergence, as I talked about in my top 20, not only from a narrative perspective because of everything that happened with T1 when he sat out for quite a bit of this year, but when he was playing, he was mechanically more dominant than we had seen in recent years. His laning stats were phenomenal. His team fighting had really improved. It really felt like his individual performances weren't nearly as team-oriented as they had been in the previous few years, and I think that's a major asset for Faker. If he's still going to be a borderline top 10 player in the world, that's massive for T1, because it's not like you have slouches everywhere else. You have an argument to be made that you have a team full of potential top 20 players. Now, I certainly don't think they've performed like that up until this point, but Faker has been phenomenal, and you cannot give him too much of the responsibility for if this team does underperform. I think obviously him sitting out a majority of the split, for those who don't watch the LCK, he had some wrist injuries, and so he wasn't playing a lot of the summer regular season, but when he was out of the lineup and when they had Poby, their young, very, very young, I should say, challenger mid laner in there instead, they were awful. They went like 1-9, like they were one of the worst teams, if not the single worst team in the LCK. Without Faker, he comes right back in. They go on a big run to get to the finals of the LCK once again. And it just goes to show you how much of an impact he has mentally on the rest of this team, even if he's not directly impacting the game. Although he does directly impact a lot of the games he's in as well. But let's talk about the bot lane next, because I think they were probably the part of the map that was the least impacted by Faker not being there. I think that they were probably the more stable of the sides of the map. We'll talk about top lane when we get there, but Guma in particular, I think, was pretty much consistent throughout the entirety of the summer split. Talked about his year in a whole, as a whole, I guess I should say, in the top 20 video, where he was kind of the one member of T1 that wasn't a unanimous first-team All-Pro vote in spring, when it felt like everybody on that team was just playing out of their minds. Guma was kind of the one that was, I don't want to say forgotten, but he wasn't getting nearly as many resources as everybody else, and his lane mate in KIA was the unanimous MVP, and so he kind of went under the radar, at least a little bit, but Summer definitely not. He got a lot more resources. The team certainly wanted to play for him more, and I think he capitalized on that well. He's still one of the best AD carries in the world. He's not the flashiest. He's not going to destroy the most amount of games, but he's more than good enough to win Worlds with, and I think that's very obvious. And then KIA, what a different conversation you have to have, right? Because he was the unanimous MVP in the spring split for the LCK, and at the end of that split, I honestly would have told you that he was the best player in the world. That's really where I was at with KIA, is that he was just so much better than everybody else that he was playing against. He was changing the meta with marksman in the support position. There just wasn't anything you could do to really stop him. There really was nobody in the world, even in the LCK, where that talent pool is so ridiculously deep, that could do anything about KIA, but Summer was not the same for him, man. He really struggled a lot in the summer split, and it was concerning, and honestly, it made me really rethink whether or not, you can build around KIA as your #1 player. I still think that he is close to that, and I think his struggles were a bit overrated by the community just because the team was struggling so much. I still think bot lane was definitely the biggest positive, but KIA was far from an MVP caliber player. You could argue he was not even an all-pro caliber player in the LCK in the summer split, so two halves of the season that you kind of have to judge for him, but KIA has been an elite, #1 or #2 support in the world for like 3 straight years in a row, so you have to imagine that the good will eventually start to outweigh the bad. It's just worth noting that it hasn't always been good this year. And then the top side of the map. This is where the question marks really do arise for T1. We'll start with Zeus, because I have less question marks about Zeus, which is ironic, because I think a lot of the fan base probably has more question marks for Zeus, but he had a phenomenal playoff run. You can talk about how he might have struggled a bit in the regular season, especially when Faker left. Although, again, very similar to KIA, I think that was very much overstated. He had a couple of great games when Faker was not in. He just didn't win every single time, which is fine, but his playoff run was exceptional. He was arguably the single best player in the LCK playoffs. Like, regardless of team outcome, Zeus was ridiculously impressive. And I know the narrative around him has always been that he's kind of not a big game performer, but for him to be so clutch in a very clutch playoff run for T1 to get them to the World Championships, it does give me some confidence and some hope that maybe he's starting to overcome those demons a little bit. We know it's a big deal for him. It's something that's very clearly on his mind, and so I do hope that he can figure it out. But Owner, on the other hand, I'm for real concerned about. He is someone that was really bad in the summer split. Of all the people who suffered the most from Faker not being in the team, Owner was by far the most egregious, where as soon as Faker left, he was a disaster. Like, he was really, really bad. Bottom 1, bottom 2 jungler in the LCK when things were not going his way. His pathing became worse. His confidence became worse. He was not going for a lot of plays. I don't really know why. Faker's not micromanaging his pathing, so I don't know. Maybe it was just a confidence thing, but even when Faker did come back in the playoffs, Owner was still probably the weak link for T1 and the reason that they lost to Gen.G, and so there are concerns about whether or not Owner is a world-class jungler and whether or not he's going to be able to keep up, because a lot of his flaws kind of have been exploited over the course of this year, but we know Owner can be very good. This is a former World Finals jungler and somebody who's consistently been able to be at the top of the LCK in terms of all-pro standings. He was great in the spring split. We know it's in him. It's just a confidence thing. If he can get back to the form he was in 6 months ago rather than what he was in a month ago, then I think they're going to be fine, because I trust Faker a lot. I trust Guma and KIA a lot, and I think Zeus gets a bad rap for how he's performed at previous World Championships. It's all on Owner, in my opinion. He really is the swing player for whether or not T1 is going to be able to live up to this expectation, or whether or not they are going to be closer to the number 5 seed that they were in the LCK coming into the playoffs. So certainly going to be an interesting conversation surrounding T1 because of the dichotomy between the differences in their first half and their second half, but for me, I'm willing to believe that this team is going to figure it out because it's T1 and Faker at Worlds. It just feels right. And here we are, the top 2 teams at the tournament, at Worlds 2023, and these are probably the top 2 you were expecting. I'm not going to break any ground and change anybody's opinions by putting these 2 teams as the 2 teams in my S tier. I believe they are kind of a cut above everybody else in terms of what they've shown over the course of this year, and I would love, anybody who follows the channel knows, I would love to do something controversial. I would love to change up this list if I truly did believe that it was different, if I truly did believe that the 2 teams that finished as the number 1 seeds in their respective regions weren't the 2 best teams at the tournament. But, you know, I also want to give you my honest opinion, and I really do, after watching a full year, believe these are the 2 best teams at the tournament. So what order are they in? Probably the one you already expect, but coming in at number 2 in my power rankings, it is going to be Gen.G. They are fantastic. They're so good. They've been the best team in Korea all year long, really, and they deserve to be here. I know a lot of people have continuously doubted this Gen.G team. I was one of the doubters at the beginning of the year. When you think back to January and February, I was definitely a little bit lower on the construction of this team, mostly because I wasn't sold on the bot lane. Pays and Delight were 2 players that I just wasn't completely convinced were going to be world-class immediately, specifically Delight, who I was very concerned about because I thought his tape on Breon was overrated for what people were hyping him up to be. Pays was considered this ridiculous prodigy. I figured he was probably going to, at the very least, have some hurdles coming into the LCK, one of the hardest regions in the world as a 17-year-old, but both of those things ended up not being problems at all for this team. Delight has been fantastic, one of the better supports in the LCK, and even if I do think he is overrated by the community, at the very least a little bit, because I don't think he's a top 3 support in the world, I still think he's very good, and I rank him in the tier of very, very good supports. He's right sandwiched in between KIA and Kellen, who I talk about endlessly on this channel, and so you know I really do believe that Delight is an upper tier support, someone you can win worlds with very easily. I truly do believe in Delight at that level now, but Pays is really the reason that this team has completely changed my perception of what they could be, because Pays is not just a 17-year-old that is trying to find his way in this team and internationally and, you know, going to his first Worlds. He was the MVP of the LCK in the summer split. He was the single best player in Korea in the summer split. That's not easy, and that's not easy when you're 25. Let alone when you're 17 years old and this is your first ever year in professional play. Pays has been an absolute monster. He's been everything that Ruler was for this team and then some. He's so mechanically talented. Now, he's not a perfect player. He's certainly got his flaws, I think, as opposed to what Ruler was, which was definitely much more of an early game and mostly mid-game AD carry for Gen.G last year, being able to snowball games out of control incredibly quickly. Pays is a late-game team fighter, or at the very least, that's where he feels the most comfortable. He loves getting towards the back half of games and then just being able to outplay and outfight his opponents. If he can get there from neutral, he's going to do really well in those scenarios. But That doesn't mean he's a bad laner. I'm not trying to sit here and say that the 2v2 for Gen.G is poor by any stretch. It's just not really something that they play for nearly as much as they did last year with a similar configuration. They play a lot more for topside, honestly, in the early game, which is something we will talk about. But Pays and Delight are fantastic. Pays in particular is world-class. He's 17 and he came in as number 8 on my top 20 list at Worlds. Absolutely ridiculous, and Delight is certainly not a slouch. They are an elite level bot lane. And then you get to talk about the jungle mid duel. Are you kidding me? It's Peanut and Chovy. I said this last year, but it's just unfair that you have these two players with these two skill sets playing together, because I do think they complement each other better than almost any other jungle mid in the world. I said that last year. They were easily the best jungle mid in the world, and, you know, while I think that conversation's a little bit different now because of the way that teams have developed and just kind of the construction of rosters at the top, Peanut and Chovy are probably the most complementary jungle mid duo in the entire world. They are that good. Peanut's that primary facilitator, doesn't really take a lot of resources. In fact, the team really doesn't want to give him any resources, and so he really spends a lot of his time making sure that the rest of his laners are in a good spot, and Chovy is the resource king. People honestly have criticized him in the past for taking too many resources, which is something obviously I pushed back on. But even that he's gotten super better at. Like, you can't even criticize him for that in the LCK anymore, because he basically spent the entirety of this year being a shove and roam mid laner, and that's not Chovy's style at all. And so you've got to give them a lot of credit for adapting and making sure that their games are super well-rounded, but Chovy can still be the best player in the world. He comes in as the number 2 mid laner, but that's only because I'm ridiculously high on number 1. Chovy is a top 3 player. He's one of the elite S+ tier players in the world, one of the 3 S+ tier players in the world. Chovy can be the best player on a world-winning team by a country mile. Chovy's going to go down as one of the greatest of all time, and so you feel really comfortable, obviously, with him in the mid lane. Pretty much the only time he ever runs into issues is when the rest of the team is losing and he feels like it's his responsibility to win the game for his team. That's when he starts to become a little bit more of a resource magnet, going to side lanes, picking up all the CS, when he feels it's his responsibility to win the game. But when he can trust his teammates, which he is able to do a lot on this team, he's perfect. He's basically the perfect mid laner. And then for Peanut in the jungle, I should say, what can you say about Peanut? He's been around forever. He's the ultimate facilitator, but he can carry games. This team doesn't necessarily play around him all that well when he's playing carries, but we know that Peanut is an elite carry player. He was for a majority of the beginning of his career. He settled into this more supportive jungle role towards the back half, and I do think it suits him well, but he's just a very all-around versatile player that's been great for, you know, half a decade plus at this point. And so then you've got Doran in the top lane. I think Doran just had the best year of his entire career. And I know not everybody agrees with that, but in terms of getting resources and doing something with those resources, he's never really had an opportunity like this. And I've always liked Doran. Doran and Rascal were 2 players that I always compared a lot coming up through the ranks, and I think Doran has kind of solidified himself as the upper end of those 2. He's basically everything you could want. He's a great weak side top laner, although he's better on carries, and he does like to play aggressive in the 1v1s, and so sometimes he can get himself into a little bit of trouble. That's what I criticized him for last year in 2022 when I was a little bit lower on him, but he's completely changed my perception now that the team is playing around him a bit more. You can win games through Doran, and there just aren't a lot of top laners in the world that you can say that about. Comes in at number 4 for me, but look at this lineup. It's stacked top to bottom. We've talked about some, you know, at least one question mark on every single team up until this point. Every team that isn't these top 2 has at least one player that I'm not completely convinced is an all-star, is a superstar that can win worlds very comfortably. Gen.G doesn't have that. All 5 of these players are elite-level players, and that's why they come in at the S tier. They're not number 1 because number 1 is just, it's locked in. Like, there really is no other way to say it. Other than that, the team that's at number 1 will be number 1 until they prove otherwise, but Gen.G is just about as close as you can get towards dethroning them before actually being able to take them down, and I really do think a lot of people are going to be surprised that maybe the MSI performance wasn't exactly a great indicator of what we're going to see at Worlds. And that brings us to our final team of this video. If you've stuck around this long, I really do appreciate it. We're nearing the 3-hour mark. This is the longest video that I've ever posted on my YouTube channel in over 3 years, and so very much thank you for sticking around this long, but by process of elimination, you know who number 1 is. Number 1 in my power rankings at the top of S tier, and at the top of my list, it is going to be JD Gaming. They are the best team in the world right now, and there really is no disputing that until they prove otherwise. They have won everything over the course of this year. Your LPL Spring Split Champions, your MSI Champions, your LPL Summer Split Champions. They've dominated. They've done everything that they could possibly do up until this point this year. And the Golden Road is really not all that out of the question for them. They certainly have to be considered the favorites going into Worlds, and what a story it would be. This was a super team constructed with the sole purpose of being the best team that League of Legends has ever seen, and somehow, some way, they seem to be living up to that hype. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like 369 in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Knight in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and missing at support. And what do I say about these players that I haven't already said in a lot of other videos? First of all, I've done an entire, yearly long coverage of the LPL and of JD Gaming, as I did for all 4 of the major regions, as well as just doing that top 20 video for the top 20 players at Worlds. And guess what? All 5 of these players were in the top 20. They were in that video. They got deep dive explanations, so I very much recommend you go check that out. I'm still going to give you some analysis here because you sat here this long. You probably want to hear about the #1 team, but let's go ahead and just go top to bot. Just make it a little bit easier here for the final one. Let's start with 369 up on the top side. I think a lot of people look at him as the weak side top laner of this team, and I think that is justified. He does get that role quite a bit, but he's so much more than that as a player. Everybody knows the memes of he either rolls 3 or he rolls 9 on certain days, but man, when he is really on, when he rolls those triple 9s, he's ridiculous. He's a 1v1 god up in the top lane. He's great on bruisers, but he's a team fight technician. He can basically be anywhere that he needs to be at any given time. He can fill any role that the team needs him to fill. The only qualms that I have with 369 is that he does have the occasional bad game, which, quite frankly, nobody else on this team really has. Like, everyone else on this team is incredibly consistent. 369 can sometimes struggle in isolated 1v1s, especially against some of the best players in the world. We saw that against Bin in some circumstances. However, at the end of the day, he's almost always able to recover, and so you're never really looking at him as a problem. And then you've got the triple 1s in the middle here, #1 player in all of their roles, in the jungle, in the mid, in the bot. Like, it's crazy. Let's start with Kanavi. Kanavi's pretty clear-cut the best jungler in the world right now because the meta has really swayed into what Kanavi does best. Kanavi has always been known as a jungler with perfect pathing, ideal early game pressure, and knowing exactly what to do to generate an early game lead. And guess what? That's exactly what junglers are supposed to be doing in the current meta. That's the strongest thing you can do. Playing from behind right now is so difficult from that jungle position, and Kanavi is so consistently able to generate those leads that it's almost impossible to consistently be able to beat this team, purely because of how Kanavi plays. For my money, he was the best player on this team in the regular season this year in the LPL, and that is not an easy feat, but I think he has absolutely earned his spot as the #1 jungler in the world, and someone that there's basically no one I would expect to be able to take down Kanavi on any given day. And then you've got Knight in the mid lane. I mean, come on, dude. I know not everybody who watches this video is going to be a long-time listener to the channel and to these series that I do on this channel, but if this is your first introduction to me, I am, like, #1 Knight fan in the world, or at least I'm very close. He's ridiculous, and I just don't understand why the reputation surrounding him is the way that it is. He's never really put in there as the top 1 or top 2 player in the world. To me, as I said in my top 20 video, he's the #1 player in the world right now in terms of what he is able to do. He is the most flexible. He is the most consistent. He has proven it in every single big match that he has played this year. Spring Split Finals MVP, MSI Finals MVP, Summer Split Finals MVP. What else does he need to do? He has proven everything. He has done everything. He's been a carry for this team. He's been the rock even when some of these players are underperforming. I don't know what else to say. Knight is amazing, and his mechanics are right up there with anybody else in the world as well. Then you've got Ruler. For my money, like I said last year, the greatest AD carry to ever play the game. I truly do believe that, and it's not like this year changed my mind on that at all. I was saying that last year when he was playing for Gen.G. You think that him coming to JD Gaming and winning everything changed my mind on that, including the Asian games, might I add. He's just been phenomenal. He has been a hyper carry for this team. He's the greatest mid-game player ever. Like, I can't remember anybody who's so consistently in mid-game skirmishes, in mid-game, 3v3s or random 1v1s in the mid lane, just generates massive leads and advantages and just consistently is able to pick up major kills even from neutral positions every game. It's insane what Ruler is capable of doing, and he continues to be that kind of positive. And then You've got Missing in the support position, who is the pinnacle of consistency. He comes in at number 3 because he doesn't necessarily have the same kind of highs like I talked about from Lehens and On, who I do have listed above him, but his floor is higher than both of those players, in my opinion, and that is so ridiculous that he gets to play with Ruler, and he basically never has bad games. How do you get away with this? How do you get away with building a team of this caliber? It's unfair, and honestly, they are the favorites to win Worlds. But there's going to be people that come out and give you these bold takes of anybody else, but there is nobody at the bottom of their hearts that I truly believes going into this tournament that they are not the #1 team, at least in the power rankings, right? At least in the predictions. There's nothing on tape that is there to tell you that JD Gaming should be under anybody else in the world. They are the team to beat in League of Legends right now, and until they are beaten, I'm going to consider them the ultimate kings. And if they are truly able to be the first team ever to complete the golden road of winning every domestic title and every international title that they have afforded to them with, you know, a player like Ruler even winning Asian games as well, then this will, in my opinion, officially be the greatest League of Legends team of all time. Alright, but that is going to do it for my Worlds Primer video here in 2023. Truly, if you made it to the end of this 3-hour-long video, I am nothing but appreciative of you. I really do mean that. We put so much time, so much effort, not only into making these videos, but of course into watching every single game that was played domestically and internationally in 2023 for every single team that we talked about here at the World Championships. I really would appreciate it, and it would mean a lot to me if you guys left a like on this video just to let me know that you guys enjoyed it. I really can't stress enough how many hours this took to get done, and it really does mean a lot to me to let me know that this is not going to waste. This effort is, you know, resonating with a lot of you guys. Of course, if you're new here, hit subscribe. We have covered so much, and I've given such in-depth analysis. You're just not going to find this anywhere else on the internet when it comes to League of Legends coverage from any of the major, you know, streamers that you guys are, you know, probably following. This is the place for the in-depth coverage. I promise you that. We're going to be covering every single day of Worlds action across the entirety of the month until the tournament is over, and then, of course, off-season's right around the corner, too. You're just not going to find a channel that's going to go more in-depth on all of that than here, so hit subscribe so you can be notified when those videos do end up going live on this channel. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all